The local archive was a building of quiet shadows and forgotten moments, nestled in the heart of the town like a sleeping giant wrapped in dust and memories. Its walls, lined with countless recordings and brittle documents, held the stories of generations. But on this particular night, something extraordinary stirred in the stillness just as the clock neared midnight. Evelyn Chang, the lead archivist, sat alone at her desk, the soft glow of a desk lamp illuminating the small notebook she kept close, a collection of unsent letters to her estranged father, whose silence had shaped much of her life. She was used to the archive's hushed ambience, the occasional creak of floorboards, or the distant hum of the town settling into sleep. But tonight there was a tension in the air, a palpable charge that prickled her skin. Across the room, Marcus Reed adjusted the settings on a recording device, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was the skeptic in their small team, a former engineer who had returned to the town after a professional setback, seeking a quieter life but carrying a heavy burden of guilt. He approached the archive's sudden phenomenon with a scientist's precision, determined to uncover a logical explanation. Lila Moreno, the community liaison, moved among the shelves with a blend of reverence and curiosity. Her vibrant clothing reflected her warm spirit, and her keen eyes scanned the room as if searching for unseen threads that connected the voices of the past to the living. Descended from one of the town's founding families, she understood the weight of history and the secrets that lingered beneath the surface. As the clock struck midnight, a faint murmur rose from the speakers embedded in the archive's walls. At first, it was indistinct, like a breeze stirring through old pages. Then, voices emerged, soft, trembling, and charged with emotion. They spoke not in clear sentences, but in fragments of urgent pleas, words soaked with regret and longing, seeking forgiveness. Evelyn's breath caught. The voices stirred memories she had long tried to bury. One in particular sent a shiver down her spine, a voice that bore an uncanny resemblance to her father, whispering a name she hadn't uttered in years. Her hands tightened around the notebook, the unsent letters suddenly feeling like fragile bridges to a past she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Marcus's fingers hovered over the controls, his scientific mind racing to process the anomaly. Was it some elaborate trick, a technical glitch? Yet, the voices carried a weight, an emotion that defied his rational explanations. He felt the stirrings of doubt and wonder, emotions he had long suppressed. Lila stepped closer to the speakers, her heart swelling with a mix of warmth and sorrow. These voices were not mere echoes. They were threads of memory weaving through the fabric of the community. She imagined the families behind each voice, the stories waiting to be told, the secrets yearning to be uncovered. The three archivists exchanged glances, a silent understanding passing between them. The archive was no longer just a repository of records. It was a vessel of unresolved farewells and buried truths. Their roles had shifted from passive keepers of history to active guardians of voices that demanded to be heard. In the quiet that followed, the voices faded, leaving behind a lingering ache, a melancholic yearning that settled deep within their souls. The archive held its breath, waiting for the next midnight, for the next echo from the past. Evelyn closed her eyes, whispering a vow to listen, to help, and perhaps to finally find the forgiveness she sought, not just for the voices in the archive, but for herself as well. As dawn approached, the archivists began to plan. Questions hung in the air like fragile glass. Who were these voices? Why did they plead for forgiveness now? And what secrets lay hidden beneath the surface of their quiet town? The journey had begun, guided by the haunting whispers that echoed through the midnight archive. The morning light filtered weakly through the tall windows of the local archive, casting long, faint shadows across the shelves, heavy with dusty reels and brittle tapes. Evelyn Chang sat at the worn wooden table, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of a tape recorder as she prepared to listen again to the voices they had first heard at midnight. The air was thick with silence except for the faint hum of the ancient machine winding the tape forward, and the faint crackle of static that preceded the voice. "Please forgive me," a woman's voice whispered through the speakers, fragile and trembling with a sorrow that seemed to transcend time. Evelyn closed her eyes, the sound pulling at something deep inside her. She thought of her father, the man who had vanished without explanation, leaving behind only silence and a trail of unanswered questions. The voice on the tape was not her father's, but its raw vulnerability stirred the familiar ache of loss she carried like a shadow. Across the room, Marcus Reed adjusted the microphone, his brow furrowed in concentration. His engineer's mind sought patterns, triggers, anything that could explain the phenomenon without invoking the inexplicable. "This has to be some form of auditory pareidolia, or a technical glitch," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. But as he listened to the same voice Evelyn heard, a flicker of doubt crossed his features. How could such emotional depth and specificity be a mere anomaly? Lila Moreno, meanwhile, had slipped out into the crisp autumn day. The town was quiet, but beneath its calm surface, stories swirled like leaves caught in an eddy of wind. Lila's mission was clear: to connect the voices with the living, to bridge the gap between past and present. Her footsteps echoed softly on the cracked pavement as she made her way to the home of Harold Jensen, a longtime resident and retired factory worker whose family had been a fixture in the community for decades. Inside his modest house, Harold sat stiffly in his favorite armchair, the fabric worn thin from years of use. The news of the voices had unsettled him, dredging up memories he preferred to keep locked away. When Lila explained that the archive had recordings of his late wife, he had grimaced but agreed to listen. Now, as the faint voice of his wife filled the room, pleading for forgiveness, his hands trembled. The past he had tried to bury demanded acknowledgement, and Harold was caught between denial and the raw pain of unresolved grief. Back at the archive, the three archivists reconvened to share their findings. Evelyn spoke softly of the voice's emotional resonance, admitting how the recordings stirred her own unresolved feelings about her father. Marcus presented his initial analyses, admitting the data was inconclusive but intriguing. Lila described the stories she had gathered, each adding threads to a growing tapestry of community history and secrets. "These voices," Evelyn said, "they're more than just recordings. They're fragments of lives, of regrets, of love and forgiveness left unspoken." Marcus nodded, struggling to reconcile his scientific skepticism with the undeniable emotional weight carried by the voices. "We need to document everything carefully," he said, "but we also need to be sensitive to what these recordings mean to the families." Lila smiled gently, her eyes shining with determination. "Our community has been shaped by these hidden stories. It's time we face them together." As the afternoon faded into evening, the archive felt both heavier and more alive. The voices, once distant echoes, were becoming a living part of the town's collective memory. For Evelyn, Marcus, and Lila, the path forward was uncertain but necessary. They were no longer just archivists. They were guardians of memory, conduits for healing, and witnesses to the delicate dance between silence and voice. Outside, the wind stirred the fallen leaves in restless spirals, as if whispering secrets only the midnight hours could reveal. And within the archive, the voices waited patiently to be heard. Their echoes of the past reaching out to touch the fragile present. The clock in the local archive struck midnight, its chime resonating softly through the labyrinthine corridors lined with shelves heavy with dusty recordings and fragile tapes. Evelyn Chang sat at her desk, the low glow of a desk lamp casting gentle shadows on her face. The usual stillness of the night was interrupted only by the faint crackle of an old tape recorder, its speaker emitting a whispery voice that seemed to float ethereally in the stale air. "Harold, please. Forgive me," the voice pleaded, trembling with emotion and the weight of years lost. Evelyn's eyes closed briefly, the words echoing inside her like a fragile prayer. She recognized that voice, the voice of Margaret Jensen, the late wife of Harold Jensen, the gruff yet guarded patriarch of one of the town's oldest families. The voice was haunting, delicate yet urgent, filled with regret and longing. Across the room, Marcus Reed adjusted his glasses, his skeptical gaze fixed on the audio analyzer screen. The waveforms danced erratically, defying the neat patterns of typical voice recordings. "This shouldn't be possible," he muttered, the scientific part of his mind resisting the inexplicable phenomenon that was unfolding nightly in the archive. Yet here it was, voices of the deceased, begging for forgiveness, their messages as clear as if spoken moments ago. Lila Moreno paced nearby, her vibrant attire a stark contrast to the muted surroundings. She had spent the afternoon reaching out to families, weaving together threads of oral histories and community memories. The emergence of Margaret Jensen's voice was unlike anything before. It stirred a ripple of unease and pain in the tightly knit community. Lila knew that this was more than an anomaly. It was a call to confront the buried grief and secrets that the town had long avoided. Evelyn leaned back, her fingers trembling as she reached for a small notebook she kept tucked in her jacket pocket. Inside were unsent letters to her own estranged father, a silent testament to her personal struggle with unresolved farewells. Listening to Margaret's voice, Evelyn felt a deep kinship with the pain it carried. It was a reminder that the archive was more than a repository of voices, it was a vessel of memories, a fragile bridge between the living and the dead. Meanwhile, Harold Jensen sat alone in his weathered armchair at home, the worn cap he always wore pulled low over his face. The voice that had echoed through the archive haunted him still. Memories of Margaret flooded back her laughter, the sharpness of her temper, the long silences before she passed. He clenched his fists, torn between the instinct to deny the pain and the aching need for reconciliation. The voices in the archive were no longer distant whispers, but a mirror reflecting his own unresolved grief. Lila's decision to organize a small community gathering was met with mixed reactions. Some welcomed the chance to share, while others feared the reopening of wounds better left closed. The room at the community hall was modest, but filled with an undercurrent of anticipation. As families trickled in, their faces a blend of curiosity, sorrow, and guarded hope, Lila took the floor. "We all carry stories," she began, her voice steady yet warm. "The archive has given us a chance to listen to those who came before Ustu, understand their regrets, their hopes, and their love. Tonight, let us share those stories with each other, to find connection and maybe, in time, forgiveness." Marcus stood at the back, his arms crossed, watching as the room responded. He felt the familiar tug of doubt, but also a strange stirring of empathy. The voices were no longer just data points. They were lifelines to the human heart. Evelyn found herself drawn into conversations, her usual reticence softened by the shared vulnerability around her. When Harold Jensen arrived late, the atmosphere shifted. His presence was a silent acknowledgement of the community's pain and a tentative step toward healing. The voice of his late wife had pierced the veil of silence, forcing truths into the light. As the night deepened, stories unfolded, fragments of forgiveness spoken aloud, tears shed quietly, and the first tentative gestures of understanding offered across generational divides. The archive pulsed with the resonance of these voices, no longer just echoes but catalysts for change. Yet beneath the surface, tensions simmered. Marcus grappled with his scientific doubts and the undeniable emotional currents pulling at him. Evelyn wrestled with the shadows of her own past, the archive's voices stirring memories she had long tried to silence. Lila balanced her passion for community with the delicate task of protecting herself from the emotional toll. The chapter closed on the fragile hope that the voices, once mere whispers, might pave the way for a collective reckoning. The archive, once a silent keeper of records, had become a living testament to the power of memory and the human need for forgiveness. As the voices faded with the approaching dawn, the archivists prepared for the journey ahead, knowing that each fragment of forgiveness carried the weight of a lifetime. "We're only just beginning," Evelyn whispered into the quiet, her gaze lingering on the empty tape recorder. "And there's so much more to hear." Outside, the first light of morning crept over the town, promising a new day steeped in the echoes of the past. The clock in the archive ticked steadily toward midnight, the dim light from the overhead lamps casting long shadows across the rows of dusty shelves and aged recording devices. Evelyn Chang sat alone at the center of the room, the soft hum of the playback machine the only sound accompanying her breath. Her fingers hovered over the controls, hesitant but compelled to press play once more. The voice that emerged was faint and fragmented, but unmistakably familiar. "Evelyn," it whispered, carried on a breath of static and silence. The sound was like a thread pulling at the frayed edges of her memory, unraveling years of carefully guarded pain. Her throat tightened as the voice faltered, a plea for forgiveness tangled with confusion and regret. She pressed pause, heart pounding, the room suddenly to still. She pulled her notebook closer, small, worn volume filled with unsent letters to her father, words she had never dared to speak aloud. Each page was a testament to the silence that had stretched between them for decades. A silence she had lived with, but never fully understood. Now, those silences spoke back to her, echoing through the archive's walls in a way that made it impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, across the room, Marcus Reed sat hunched over his laptop, his eyes darting between the spectral data and the waveforms of the voices they had recorded. His fingers flew over the keyboard, running algorithms and cross-referencing anomalies. But tonight, the data defied explanation. The voices appeared to shift frequencies unpredictably, their acoustic signatures fluctuating beyond any known pattern. Marcus leaned back, rubbing his temples. This wasn't just a supernatural curiosity anymore, it was a scientific enigma challenging every assumption he had. His skepticism wavered as he realized that these voices were not mere echoes, but something far more complex and emotionally charged. Across the town, Lila Moreno found herself at the heart of a gathering in the community center. The room was alive with the vibrant colors of traditional textiles and the soft murmur of voices weaving stories from the past. Elders shared memories of loved ones long gone, their stories bridging the gap between generations. Lila moved among them, her expressive face lighting up as she listened and contributed, weaving together threads of heritage and hope. The warmth of the gathering stood in stark contrast to the cold silence that awaited Evelyn back at home. In the quiet of their shared family house, she lingered near the doorway, shadowed by memories and the weight of unspoken words. Tommy, her younger brother, sat across the room, his expression guarded, the chasm between them palpable. Her notebook lay on the kitchen table, each unsent letter a monument to her reluctance to reach out. The soft glow of the evening light seemed to highlight the distance she had kept not just from Tommy, but from herself. Tonight, the archive's voices had stirred something deep within her, a silent burden she could no longer carry alone. As the midnight hour approached, the archive itself seemed to pulse with quiet urgency. Voices whispered through the corridors, their pleas for forgiveness threading through the stillness. Evelyn knew that to help the families who relied on the archive's revelations, she first had to confront her own past. The question loomed, could she find the courage to break the silence with Tommy, to face the shadows that had loomed over them both for so long? Marcus closed his laptop slowly, the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, replaced by a determined resolve. The phenomenon was no longer just a puzzle to be solved, was a call for empathy, for understanding that transcended logic. Lila's voice rose amid the stories, a bridge between the old wounds and the promise of healing. The community's tapestry was fraying in places, but with every shared memory, it grew stronger. And in the quiet archive, Evelyn took a deep breath, the weight of silent burdens pressing upon her. The night was far from over, and the voices were only just beginning to speak their truths. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone, the first step toward reaching out to Tommy, uncertain but necessary. The archive's echoes were not just a phenomenon, they were a mirror reflecting the fragile bonds of family, memory, and forgiveness. Tonight, those bonds would be tested as never before. The room grew colder, shadows lengthening, but Evelyn's resolve hardened. The silent burdens she carried were no longer hers to bear alone. The archive was calling, and she would answer. With one last glance at the flickering playback machine, she stood and stepped into the darkness beyond the archive's walls, the voices of the past following close behind. The night held its breath. The night had fallen into a hush when the voices began again, their ethereal whispers threading through the shadows of the archive's labyrinthine corridors. Evelyn Chang, Marcus Reed, and Lila Moreno sat clustered around the aging tape recorder, its surface worn and yellowed, a relic that had become the vessel for the town's most intimate and painful memories. Tonight, the air felt heavier than usual, charged with a quiet anticipation as the tape clicked to life. A fragile, trembling female voice emerged, fraught with longing and regret. It spoke of names that resonated deeply within the community, names that linked families long thought separate by time and circumstance. Evelyn's breath caught as the voice unfolded a story of betrayal and silence. It was a confession, a plea for forgiveness that stretched across decades, weaving together the histories of families who had never before realized their fates were intertwined. The voice belonged to a woman whose identity was only partly known, her words a bridge between past and present, binding wounds that had festered in quiet isolation. As the last echoes faded, the room seemed to shrink under the weight of the revelation. Marcus adjusted his glasses, his analytical mind racing to process the implications. "This changes everything," he murmured, voice low but steady. "We're not just cataloguing voices anymore. We're custodians of truths that could unravel the fabric of this community." Lila nodded, her usually warm expression shadowed by concern. "We have to be careful. These families, if they find out what connects them, it could open old wounds, or maybe even start new conflicts. We need to think about how to handle this delicately." Evelyn folded her hands, her gaze distant as memories of her own fractured family flickered at the edges of her mind. The voices in the archive were no longer just echoes. They were a summons to confront the past. She felt the familiar tug of responsibility, the pull to be the emotional anchor for those who had no voice left to speak. "We can't keep this secret," Evelyn said finally, her voice quiet but resolute. "If we don't face it, who will? But we have to do it with compassion and care. We owe them that much." The debate that followed was tense and fraught. Marcus, ever the skeptic turned believer, wrestled with the ethical implications. From a scientific standpoint, documenting this is invaluable. But exposing these secrets, there's a risk of harm that we can't ignore. Lila, caught between her community ties and her role as mediator, advocated for transparency tempered with sensitivity. People have the right to know their histories, but we must prepare them for what they might hear. The archive is not just a building. The morning sun filtered softly through the high windows of the local archive, casting long golden beams that danced across the dust motes suspended in the still air. The building, with its labyrinthine corridors and weathered shelves, seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. Today was different. Today, a new visitor would cross the threshold, one whose presence promised to stir the settled layers of memory and silence that cloaked the town. Maya Patel stepped carefully over the threshold, her footsteps muted on the worn wooden floor. The faint scent of aged paper and dust mingled with the coolness of the archive's interior, a sensory welcome to a place steeped in history. Her bright eyes scanned the dimly lit room, taking in the rows of cabinets, the spools of old recordings, and the soft glow of desk lamps where archivists bent over their work. She clutched a small leather-bound journal to her chest, a talisman of sorts, filled with notes, questions, and fragments of her grandmother's past. "Welcome to the archive," a warm voice greeted her. Maya turned to see Evelyn Chang approaching, her calm demeanor and thoughtful eyes immediately putting her at ease. Evelyn extended a hand, which Maya accepted with a grateful smile. "I'm Maya," she said softly. "I'm here because of the voices, my grandmother's voice." Evelyn nodded, her expression both professional and deeply empathetic. "We've heard her. She's been part of the phenomenon for a while now. Please, come with me." As they walked through the corridors, Evelyn shared the history of the archive's transformation from a mundane repository to a vessel for voices that echoed at midnight. Voices that spoke of regret, forgiveness, and long-hidden truths. Maya listened intently, her fingers brushing the spines of old records as if trying to touch the memories they contained. In a quiet corner of the archive, bathed in the soft glow of a desk lamp, the two women settled. Maya opened her journal, revealing faded photographs and scribbled recollections. "My grandmother always spoke in riddles about our family's past," Maya confessed. "I never understood until I heard her voice here. It's like the archive is a bridge between the living and the dead, between the past and the present." Evelyn smiled gently. "That's why we're here. To help people cross that bridge, to find closure and understanding." Meanwhile, across the room, Marcus Reed was immersed in his work. His glasses perched low on his nose, he adjusted the dials of the recording equipment with practiced precision. The data on his screen flickered with irregular patterns, anomalies that defied his previous understanding of the phenomenon. His skepticism warred with the undeniable evidence. "This can't be explained by conventional means," he muttered, eyes narrowing. "There's something more, something we haven't uncovered yet." Lila Marino's voice rang out in the adjacent room where a gathering of town elders had convened. The archive had never before hosted an event like this. The cold, labyrinthine halls that usually held only the quiet hum of old machines and whispered voices were now transformed. Tables draped in soft linens bore the weight of photographs, journals, and faded cassette tapes. The air thick with a mixture of dust, anticipation, and the faint scent of old paper. Families from across town, some hesitant, some eager, gathered slowly, their faces lit by the dim amber glow of vintage lamps and the occasional flicker of a projector casting shadows on the cracked walls. Evelyn Chang stood near the front, her hands folded loosely in front of her. She felt the familiar tremble in her chest, the old ache of vulnerability that she usually kept buried. Tonight was different. Tonight, she was not just an archivist cataloguing voices. She was a participant in this collective reckoning. Her eyes scanned the crowd faces marked by years of silence, grief, and unresolved tension. Among them were Harold Jensen, his stoic presence a testament to the weight of loss. Maya Patel, whose bright eyes betrayed both curiosity and the painful search for belonging, and countless others whose histories were now woven into the tapestry of the archive. Marcus Reed adjusted his glasses, a notebook clutched awkwardly in one hand. He had spent months trying to analyze the phenomenon scientifically, but tonight the data felt insufficient. As the voices began to play softly through the speakers snippets of apologies, whispered regrets, and unfinished goodbyes, the room grew still. It was as if the past itself had taken physical form, pressing gently against the hearts of all present. Lila Moreno, radiant in a vibrant red dress that contrasted with the archive's muted tones, moved through the crowd with practiced ease. Her warmth was a bomb, but even she could not fully mask the tension that flickered beneath the surface. The stories being shared had opened old wounds, and the fragile balance she worked so hard to maintain threatened to shatter. As the event progressed, Evelyn found herself stepping forward. "I want to share something personal," she said, her voice steady but soft. "For years, my father was a silence I couldn't break. Tonight, hearing these voices, I understand the cost of unsaid words." Her confession rippled through the room like a pebble dropped into still water. She unfolded a small notebook, the pages filled with letters never sent, words she had written to a father who had disappeared from her life. "These are my unsent letters," she continued, "and perhaps, through these voices, we all find a way to speak what we've held inside." The audience responded not with applause, but with a profound, collective intake of breath. It was a moment of shared vulnerability that cracked open the walls between them. Marcus surprised them all when he spoke next. "I've spent months trying to explain this phenomenon with data and logic," he admitted, "but tonight I realize some truths exist beyond numbers. These voices, they remind me of my own failings, the mistakes I've tried to bury." He paused, eyes glistening, before continuing. "Perhaps this archive is not just about preservation, but about healing." The room shifted, emotions swelling and ebbing like the tide. But not all moments were gentle. The clock in the dim archive room ticked relentlessly toward midnight, its steady rhythm a stark contrast to the turmoil roiling inside Evelyn Chang. Tonight, like many others, she had sat surrounded by reels of old tapes and fragile recordings, silent witnesses to lives long past, but never truly gone. But tonight was different. Tonight, the voices that had haunted the archive's corridors for weeks promised something more personal, more urgent. Evelyn's fingers trembled as she adjusted the dial on the aging tape player, the faint hiss of static filling the quiet space. Her breath caught when the voice emerged, soft, hesitant, and achingly familiar. "Evelyn, if you can hear this." The words were fragile, threaded with the weight of years left unspoken. It was her father's voice, an echo from the past that sent a shiver through her. She closed her eyes, the tape crackling softly as the voice continued, offering apologies that had never reached her ears, regrets that filled the silences of her childhood. For a moment, the sterile archive faded away. She was a little girl again, waiting for a father who had vanished without a trace, for answers that never came. The message was incomplete, fragmented by static, but it was enough. Enough to shatter the carefully constructed walls she'd built around her pain. Unable to hold back, Evelyn pulled out her small notebook filled with unsent letters, to him words she had never dared to send. Letters filled with longing, anger, and unanswered questions. Now, with the voice breathing life into her memories, those letters felt like a fragile bridge to a past she had tried to forget. In the next room, Marcus Reed sat by the rain-speckled window, his gaze distant as he reviewed his meticulous notes. The scientific part of his mind raced to explain the phenomena: electromagnetic anomalies, residual sound waves, psychological suggestion, but the growing emotional weight defied logic. He rubbed his temples, the tension evident in the tight set of his jaw. He had come to the archive seeking clarity, a way to redeem himself from a past mistake that haunted him like a shadow. Yet with every new voice, every plea for forgiveness, the lines between observer and participant blurred. He found himself empathizing, feeling the raw pain embedded in the recordings, and questioning the cold detachment he once prized. Marcus closed his notebook with a sigh. The voices were no longer just data points. They were fragments of human stories he could no longer observe without feeling. This growing conflict gnawed at him, challenging everything he believed about himself and the world. Meanwhile, across town in a cozy cafe warmed by amber light, Lila Moreno leaned in toward a frail, elderly woman whose eyes held decades of hidden stories. The conversation flowed freely, laughter mingling with tears, as Lila learned of a secret buried deep within her family's legacy, one that redefined her understanding of her ancestors and the community she served. The revelation was bittersweet, a delicate thread woven into the tapestry of cultural heritage and personal identity. Lila felt the familiar tug of responsibility to honor the past, to bridge divides, but also to protect herself from the emotional toll that came with such knowledge. Back in the archive, Evelyn paused in a quiet hallway, her fingers tracing the edges of a faded family photograph pinned to the wall. The faces stared back at her frozen moments of a life that had slipped through her grasp. She clutched her notebook tighter, the pages heavy with unsent words and fragile hope. The silence here was thick, almost tangible, pressing against her chest. But amidst the weight, a spark of resolve ignited. She would reach out to Tommy. She would try to heal the fractures that had long divided them. It was a daunting step, fraught with uncertainty and fear, but the voice from the past had given her courage. The archive itself seemed to hum with anticipation, as if aware of the turning point unfolding within its walls. The voices that once whispered only to the archivists now echoed with new meaning, beckoning toward reconciliation, understanding, and perhaps forgiveness. As Evelyn prepared to take her first step toward mending the past, Marcus wrestled with his own transformation, and Lila navigated the complex terrain of heritage and truth. The weight of silence pressed on them all, but beneath it, a fragile hope stirred an aching yearning for connection and peace. The night deepened, and with it, the voices grew louder, more insistent, calling out across time and memory. In this crucible of grief and longing, the archivists faced their greatest challenge yet: to listen not only with their ears but with their hearts, and to find the courage to confront the shadows that had long haunted their lives. Evelyn's hands still shook as she switched off the tape player, the room now swallowed by a profound stillness. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with pain and possibility, but for the first time in years, she felt the stirrings of hope. Outside, the rain continued to fall softly, washing the world anew. Inside the archive, the voices waited to guide those willing to listen toward the fragile light of forgiveness. And as midnight gave way to the first whispers of dawn, Evelyn took a tentative breath and reached for her phone, fingers hovering over Tommy's name. The weight of silence was heavy, but the time to break it had come. The night air hung heavy with unspoken words as Evelyn Chang stood just beyond the threshold of her brother Tommy's apartment. The worn letter in her hand trembled slightly, a fragile thread connecting to people who had drifted apart like ships lost in fog. As the last vestiges of daylight slipped away, the shadows stretched long and dark, swallowing the quiet street in a solemn embrace. Evelyn's heart pounded with a mix of hope and fear. Hope that this moment might begin to bridge years of silence, and fear of the walls that might still stand between them. She lifted her hand, hesitating for a breath, before knocking softly. The door creaked open, revealing Tommy's guarded eyes. "Evelyn," he said, voice rough yet tempered with surprise. "I wasn't sure you'd come." She swallowed the lump in her throat. "I had to. There is so much left unsaid." Inside, the apartment smelled faintly of old leather and rain, a space cluttered but lived in. They sat opposite each other, the letter resting on the table like a fragile bridge. Evelyn began to speak of their father, the silence that had haunted their childhood, the unanswered questions that kept her awake at night. Tommy listened, his expression unreadable, but his eyes betraying a flicker of something long buried. Meanwhile, in the dim corridors of the archive, Marcus Reed wrestled with a storm of his own. Surrounded by the soft hum of aging machines and the faint crackle of recorded voices, he pored over his meticulously kept notes. Every new piece of data seemed to both illuminate and complicate the phenomenon they were witnessing. His scientific mind demanded clarity, yet the voices defied neat explanation. He was caught between the cold logic of evidence and the warm, aching humanity of the pleas for forgiveness echoing through the halls. The pressure mounted. His colleagues and some townspeople questioned the validity of his work, while others whispered of miracles and curses. Marcus felt the weight of his past mistakes pressing down, fueling his desire for redemption, but also his fear of exposing too much. Should he publish his findings, risking the fragile peace in the community, or keep them locked away, preserving silence but sacrificing truth? In the heart of the town, Lila Moreno stood before a gathering of families whose lives had been appended by the archive's revelations. Her voice was steady but impassioned as she navigated the delicate terrain of grief, blame, and hope. Her vibrant dress was a beacon in the dim community hall, a reminder of the culture and history that had shaped them all. "We cannot allow fear and resentment to tear us apart," Lila urged, her eyes sweeping the room. "These voices, these stories, they belong to all of us. They are the echoes of our shared past, the ties that bind us even in pain." Tears welled in some eyes. Others clenched fists in silent agreement or resistance. Lila's role as mediator was as exhausting as it was vital. She knew that beneath the surface, old wounds threatened to rupture anew. But she also believed in the power of storytelling and community to heal. Tonight, she would hold the fragile threads together a little longer. Back in the archive, the night deepened and the voices grew stronger. They filled the corridors with a haunting symphony of regret and longing, a chorus that wrapped around the archivists like a shared burden. Evelyn, Marcus, and Lila listened, their personal struggles momentarily eclipsed by the profound connection they felt to the lives behind the voices. Evelyn's thoughts drifted back to Tommy, to the tentative steps toward reconciliation and the uncertain path ahead. Marcus grappled with the balance between revelation and restraint, while Lila prepared for the next community gathering. knowing that every word spoken was a thread in the tapestry of healing or division. As dawn approached, the archivists found themselves standing at a crossroads. The voices would continue to echo, challenging them to confront silence with speech, pain with compassion, and secrets with truth. Their own rifts might yet heal or deepen, but the journey toward reconciliation had irrevocably begun. The archive was not just a place of memory, was a crucible where past and present collided, where the living and the dead demanded to be heard. And in that fragile balance, hope flickered a delicate light in the gathering shadows. But as the first rays of morning touched the weathered walls, a new question lingered in the air, heavier than ever. Could the archivists hold together the fractured ties of a community on the brink, or would the voices tear them all apart? The night was far from over, and the echoes of tomorrow awaited their answer. The clock's hands crept inexorably toward midnight, and the archive seemed to hold its breath. The air was thick with anticipation, a heavy silence punctuated only by the faint rustling of paper and the soft hum of the aged ventilation system. Evelyn Chang stood near the center of the dimly lit room, her fingers nervously tapping the edge of a polished wooden table. Around her, Marcus Reed adjusted his glasses, eyes scanning the recordings laid out before him, while Lila Moreno moved restlessly. Her vibrant scarf a stark contrast to the muted tones of the archive walls. Families from across the town had gathered, summoned by the archivist's urgent call. The dim glow of the overhead lamps cast long shadows, and the faint scent of old paper mingled with the distant aroma of rain from the night outside. A palpable tension gripped the room, as if the ghosts themselves lingered, waiting to speak. As the clock struck 12, a sudden hush fell. Then, slowly, the archive came alive with voices soft at first, then swelling in volume and clarity. They threaded through the aisles of aged tapes and dusty shelves, weaving stories of regret, love, and betrayal. But tonight, the voices did not merely whisper isolated sorrows, they converged, intertwining into a harrowing revelation that cut across the town's families like a jagged seam. Harold Jensen's late wife's voice emerged prominently, its frail timbre laden with sorrow and urgency. "Forgive me," it pleaded, "for the secrets I kept, for the silence that tore us apart." The crowd shifted uneasily, eyes darting between one another. Murmurs rippled through the room as fragments of other voices surfaced, revealing connections and betrayals spanning generations, lies concealed, debts unpaid, and wounds left festering in silence. Evelyn's heart pounded fiercely. She felt the weight of her role as the archive's emotional anchor pressing down on her chest. Clearing her throat, she stepped forward, voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. "These voices," she began, "are not just echoes of the past. They are calls to Usul of Usto face what has been buried too long." Marcus swallowed hard, fighting to maintain his usual analytical composure. Yet, as the voices wove their painful tapestry, his scientific skepticism faltered. He glanced at Evelyn and Lila, the raw emotion in their eyes mirroring his own internal struggle. The data, the recordings, they were more than phenomena to be studied. They were stories demanding empathy, understanding, and perhaps forgiveness. Lila, sensing the swell of emotions, raised her hands gently. "This is our community's story," she said softly, "painful as it is. We must listen not just with our ears, but with our hearts." Harold Jensen sat rigidly in the front row, his weathered face a mask of stoicism. The voice of his wife awakened memories he had long tried to bury, the laughter of a younger life, the bitter silence that followed her passing. His hands clenched the worn cap on his lap, knuckles whitening. A single tear traced a path down his cheek, unbidden but undeniable. The room held its breath as the voices faded, leaving a heavy silence that seemed to press on every soul present. The archivists exchanged glances, understanding that the delicate balance between truth and peace had been irrevocably shifted. "What do we do now?" A voice from the crowd whispered, fragile and uncertain. Evelyn met the gaze of the questioner with quiet resolve. "We listen, we face the pain together, and we begin the work of forgiveness." The night stretched on, fraught with whispered confessions and tentative steps toward healing. Some families embraced the chance to reconcile, their eyes shining with tears and hope. Others recoiled, the wounds too raw, the secrets too heavy to bear. The archivists stood at the crossroads, their own vulnerabilities laid bare as they guided the community through the tempest of emotion. Outside, the first light of dawn began to pale the sky, promising a new day. Inside the archive, the echoes of the night lingered, a haunting reminder that memory, like the archive itself, was both a burden and a gift. And as the voices receded into silence, a fragile, aching hope took root among those who had dared to listen. The reckoning had begun. The aftermath of the midnight confrontation unfolded like a slow dawn breaking through dense fog, uncertain, fragile, yet undeniably real. In the quiet sanctuary of the archive, the voices that had once struck like thunder now softened into murmurs of possibility. Evelyn Chang sat at her worn desk, the dim light casting long shadows across her small notebook, where countless unsent letters to her father awaited their fate. Tonight, however, a new page held a different kind of message. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, a hesitant breath escaping as she typed a simple, tentative greeting to Tommy. "Tommy, I don't know where to begin, but I want to talk. When you're ready, I'm here." The words felt both monumental and painfully inadequate. She stared out the rain-streaked window, the rhythmic tapping a quiet metronome to her swirling thoughts. The archive, with its labyrinthine shelves and hushed halls, felt less like a place of echoes and more like a crucible where her past and present converged. It was here, amid the voices of loss and longing, that Evelyn found the courage to confront the silence that had stretched between her and her brother for years. Down the hall, Marcus Reed sat surrounded by stacks of datasheets and blinking monitors. His glasses caught the glow of the laptop screen as he meticulously reviewed the final draft of his research presentation. His fingers paused over the keyboard, hesitating as the weight of his work settled over him. The scientific explanation for the archive's midnight phenomenon was far from complete, and yet the emotional truths he had witnessed were undeniable. He knew the town's reception would be mixed. Some would embrace his findings, others would recoil in disbelief or anger. His heart tightened with the memory of the voices, the desperate pleas for forgiveness, the raw confessions that transcended time. He had come to see the archive not just as a repository of sound, but as a living testament to the human need for connection and closure. Tonight, he would step into the light, ready to share his journey from skeptic to believer, even if it meant exposing his own vulnerabilities. Meanwhile, Lila Marino prepared for a carefully arranged community gathering in the modest meeting room adjacent to the archive. Her vibrant clothing contrasted with the subdued surroundings, a symbol of life and warmth amidst the shadows. She reviewed her notes, mindful of the delicate balance she needed to maintain. The voices had stirred old wounds and long-held secrets, and the community's response was a complex weave of resistance, curiosity, and hope. Lila's role as cultural interpreter was more critical than ever. She aimed to honor the heritage that shaped the town while encouraging openness and healing. Her voice, usually animated and impassioned, adopted a measured calm as she envisioned the conversations to come, stories shared across generations. Tears mingled with laughter, and the first tentative steps toward reconciliation. As the evening deepened, the archive itself seemed to breathe with the weight of its legacy. The dim corridors, once echoing with accusatory cries, now carried a softer resonance. The voices, fragile, fleeting, were like whispered memories threading through the silence, inviting reflection rather than confrontation. The archivists, each bearing their own burdens, found themselves united in a purpose that transcended their individual pain. Evelyn's message to Tommy remained unsent as she wrestled with doubt and hope. Would he respond? Could they bridge the chasm carved by years of silence and unspoken grief? Her heart ached with the melancholic yearning that had defined so much of her life, yet beneath it stirred a cautious optimism. Marcus's presentation loomed ahead, a crossroads between scientific inquiry and communal belief. He rehearsed his words, mindful that data alone could not capture the profound emotional truths he had encountered. His own journey toward forgiveness intertwined with the stories he told, lending his research a deeply personal dimension. Lila's preparations for the community meeting were met with mixed reactions. Some embraced the chance to heal, others clung to the comfort of silence. She understood that progress would be slow and fraught with setbacks, but her resolve remained unshaken. As the chapter drew to a close, the archive stood as a testament to the enduring power of memory and the human capacity for change. The voices, once sources of torment, now offered a fragile promise of peace. The archivists, guided by empathy and resilience, faced an uncertain future, but one imbued with the possibility of reconciliation and hope. In the stillness of the archive's corridors, the echoes of the past mingled with the whispers of tomorrow, creating a tapestry of sound and silence that held the town's collective heart. For Evelyn, Marcus, and Lila, this was not an end, but a beginning, an invitation to listen, to heal, and to remember. And so, with tentative steps and guarded hearts, they moved forward into the quiet aftermath, where every voice mattered and every story was a thread in the fabric of healing. The soft hum of the archive's ancient air conditioning mingled with the occasional rustle of paper as Maya Patel sat cross-legged on the worn wooden floor. Around her, scattered letters, faded photographs, and old cassette tapes formed a mosaic of the past, fragments of lives long gone, yet alive in memory. The dim, flickering light of a single desk lamp cast long shadows across the room, lending the space a quiet intimacy that felt both sacred and heavy. Maya's fingers trembled slightly as she lifted a brittle letter from the stack, the edges curling with age. Her grandmother's handwriting, looping and elegant, was a lifeline to a woman she had known only through stories and silence. As she read, the words whispered secrets of love, hardship, and regrets that had never found closure. Each phrase revealed a thread that connected not just her family, but others in the town, weaving a complex tapestry of shared pain and buried truths. "Look at this," Maya murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn Chang, who had wandered in quietly, knelt beside her, peering at the document with keen eyes. "You found something important." Evelyn nodded slowly, her gaze softening with empathy. "These stories, they're more than just history. They're the foundation of who we are now." Meanwhile, in the cramped office adjoining the archive's main hall, Marcus Reed adjusted his glasses as he leaned toward the glow of the laptop screen. The data he had compiled from the voices' recordings, timestamps, emotional tone analyzers painted a picture as enigmatic as it was compelling. Yet he knew that no amount of scientific rigor could fully capture the human weight these voices carried. "We need to find a way to share this," Marcus said, tapping a graph that illustrated the increasing frequency of the voices, not just as data, but as stories that people can connect with. Evelyn, seated opposite him, nodded thoughtfully. "It has to be done carefully. These voices are fragile reminders of loss and longing. If we rush, we risk alienating the very people we want to help." Their conversation stretched late into the evening, ideas flowing between them: community gatherings, storytelling events, private sessions. They envisioned a space where voices, past and present, could resonate in a way that fostered understanding rather than fear. Across town, Lila Moreno was already mobilizing. Her vibrant spirit filled the community hall as she arranged chairs in a wide circle, the soft murmur of families arriving blending with the gentle hum of anticipation. The walls were adorned with photographs from the archive, and a small speaker played faint echoes of the voices that had stirred so much unrest and revelation. "Tonight," Lila began, her voice warm and steady, "we come together not just to listen, but to share, to honor the memories that shape us, and to find connection in our stories." One by one, members of the community spoke, some tentative, others with the fierce clarity of long-held truths finally released. Tears mingled with laughter, and the voices from the archive wove through the room like a sacred chorus, reminding all present that grief and hope often dwell side by side. Back at the archive, Maya and Evelyn stood near the dusty shelves, the weight of the evening's revelations settling between them. Their eyes met, reflecting a shared understanding, melancholic yet hopeful recognition that the past's shadows could illuminate a path forward. "It's not just my grandmother's story," Maya said softly. "It's all of ours." Evelyn smiled gently, pulling her coat tighter against the night's chill. "And together we'll help these voices find their peace." As the archive settled into its quiet rhythm once more, the threads of connection woven that night promised a future where memory was both a burden and a balm, a testament to the enduring power of shared stories and the fragile hope of reconciliation. But even as the voices faded into the night, a question lingered in the still air. How far could the archivists guide their community before the unspoken truths unraveled everything they sought to protect? The answer lay waiting in the echoes yet to come. The soft hum of the archive's old air conditioning unit was the only sound in the dimly lit room where Evelyn Chang sat, her fingers tracing the edges of a worn transcript. The paper trembled slightly under her touch, as if echoing the unease that had settled deep within her chest. Outside, the town was quiet, but inside the archive, the weight of unspoken words pressed down like a suffocating fog. Evelyn's eyes moved over the lines again, the voices of the deceased spilling out in fragmented pleas and confessions. Each recording was a thread woven into the larger tapestry of the community's hidden pains. But tonight, one voice in particular gnawed at her resolve. It was a voice that spoke of betrayal and regret within a family she had grown close to. A family now reluctant to face the truth the archive unearthed. She closed the transcript, exhaling a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The familiar ache of hesitation bloomed inside, her reluctance to confront the conflicts that mirrored her own fractured past. She had spent years helping others navigate their grief, yet the thought of addressing her own familial fractures, especially with her estranged brother Tommy, filled her with a paralyzing dread. Across the archive's labyrinth of shelves and dusty records, Marcus Reed was preparing for what promised to be a challenging evening. The community meeting scheduled tonight was rapidly becoming a battleground for belief and skepticism, with many townsfolk unwilling to accept his scientific approach to the archive as inexplicable. In the meeting room, Marcus adjusted his glasses, his calm exterior belying the storm of emotions roiling beneath. As he presented his latest findings charts, waveforms, and meticulously logged data, the room's atmosphere grew thick with tension. Some attendees nodded in cautious interest, but many others exchanged wary glances, their faces etched with distrust. A sharp voice cut through the murmur. "This is all nonsense," a middle-aged man declared, standing abruptly. "You can't reduce our loved ones' voices to mere data points. There's something sacred here, something you're missing." Marcus met the man's gaze steadily, but inside he felt the sting of rejection. The pursuit of understanding had become a lonely path, one that threatened to isolate him from the very community he sought to serve. Meanwhile, Lila Moreno moved through the crowd, her usual warmth a shield she wore with practiced ease. Today, however, the vibrant colors of her outfit seemed at odds with the heaviness settling in her heart. An offhand remark from a neighbor, meant perhaps as a jest but cutting nonetheless, touched on the very secrets she had been trying to protect. For a moment, she felt the familiar pull of vulnerability, the fear of being too exposed in a community where trust was fragile. She excused herself, retreating to a quiet corner, where the echoes of laughter and conversation dimmed to a dull roar. Here, alone, she wrestled with the delicate balance between passion for her heritage and the pragmatic need to guard her own emotional well-being. Later, as the meeting adjourned, Evelyn found herself approached by Harold Jensen, an older man whose life had been shadowed by the haunting voice of his late wife emanating from the archive. His weathered face was set in a mask of reluctance, but his eyes betrayed a deep well of sorrow. "Miss Chang," he began, his voice gravelly, "I don't like what these voices are doing to my family. They're dredging up things best left buried. I'm not sure we can handle the truth." Evelyn met his gaze with gentle steadiness. "Sometimes, Mr. Jensen, the truth is the only way to begin healing. But I understand how hard that is." He nodded slowly, the tension between them a fragile bridge spanning years of pain and silence. That night, as the archive settled into its usual quiet, the archivists gathered in a small office, the weight of the day's fractures pressing upon them. Evelyn broke the silence. "We're struggling, not just with the families, but with ourselves. If we can't face these conflicts head-on, how can we expect others to?" Marcus sighed, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose. "I thought logic and data would be enough, but I'm starting to see that this is about more than just facts. It's about trust, about emotions we can't quantify." Lila nodded, her voice soft but resolute, "and about protecting ourselves. I've been so focused on others that I forgot to set boundaries. If we don't care for ourselves, we can't care for anyone else." Their shared vulnerabilities, once a source of isolation, began to weave a new strength between them. The fractures revealed by the voices of the past had exposed raw nerves and fragile hearts, but also the possibility of growth and deeper connection. As dawn approached, the archivists resolved to face the fractures not as failures, but as openings pathways toward the difficult but necessary work of healing. Outside, the archive's walls seemed to breathe with the memories they held. Silent witnesses to the unfolding story of a community learning to confront its shadows. And within that silence, the faintest whispers of hope began to stir, promising that even the deepest fractures could one day be mended. The air in the archive was thick with an unspoken solemnity as Evelyn prepared the room for the first of the private listening sessions. The dim light flickered softly against the walls lined with weathered tapes and aging equipment, each piece a vessel of memory, waiting to release its stories. She adjusted the microphone, her fingers steady despite the flutter of nerves tightening in her chest. This was no longer just about cataloging voices. It was about opening wounds long held closed and guiding others toward the fragile hope of forgiveness. Harold Jensen entered the room hesitantly, his weathered face shadowed beneath the worn cap he rarely removed. Evelyn offered a gentle smile, her presence calm and steady. "Are you ready?" she asked softly. He nodded, though the tremor in his hands betrayed his resolve. Sitting beside him, Evelyn pressed play. The static gave way to a quiet voice, fragile yet clear, the voice of Harold's late wife. It whispered apologies, a plea for understanding that spanned years of silence. The weight of the words settled over the room like a thick fog, mingling with Harold's restrained sobs. Evelyn reached out, her hand brushing his arm in a gesture of quiet solidarity. In that moment, the archive became more than a building. It was a sanctuary for sorrow and a crucible for healing. Meanwhile, in a nearby office, Marcus Reed sat with Maya Patel. The young woman's bright eyes were fixed on the glowing screen as the recording of her grandmother's voice unfolded a tale of sacrifice and hidden love. Marcus, usually the bastion of logic and detachment, found his usual reserve dissolving. The steady rhythm of scientific inquiry gave way to a newfound empathy, his throat tightening as he shared the weight of the story with Maya. "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman," he said quietly, "and her voice, it's a gift to hear her truth." Maya smiled, a mixture of relief and sorrow brushing her features. "I never knew all of this." Across the archive's main hall, Lila Moreno stood before a circle of community members gathered for another kind of session, one of storytelling and cultural reflection. Her vibrant clothing was a bold contrast to the subdued expressions of those around her. But her voice rang clear and unwavering. "We cannot heal if we remain silent," she urged, her hands moving with the passion that had become her trademark. "Our heritage is not just in what we celebrate, but in the truths we face together." The room hummed with tension and hope, a delicate balance between the pain of revelation and the possibility of reconciliation. Lila's words planted seeds of courage, encouraging others to confront the shadows that had long lingered in the town's collective memory. Later that night, Evelyn found herself alone in the narrow corridors of the archive. The faint echoes of the voices she had helped reveal drifted through the stillness, a haunting symphony of regret and love. Clutching her small notebook filled with unsent letters to her father, she paused, allowing the archive's presence to wash over her. For so long, she had internalized her pain, reluctant to confront the fractured ties that bound her to her past. But tonight, amidst the lingering voices, she felt a quiet determination kindle within her. The archive had become a mirror, not just of the families it served, but of the archivists themselves. As dawn approached, the archivists reconvened, their faces marked by the emotional weight of the day. Evelyn's newfound assertiveness was evident as she shared insights from the sessions. Advocating for a compassionate yet honest approach, Marcus, his usual guardedness softened, spoke openly about the emotional journey he was undergoing. Lila, balancing her passion with pragmatism, outlined plans to continue fostering community dialogue with sensitivity. The archive, neither malevolent nor benign, had once again fulfilled its role as a vessel of memory and reckoning. The voices, those echoes of forgiveness, continued to ripple through the dim corridors, binding the living and the dead in a shared, fragile hope. And as the archivists embraced their roles more fully, they understood that the journey toward healing was far from over. But with every whispered plea and every tear shed in the quiet rooms, the threads of reconciliation grew stronger, weaving a tapestry of melancholic yearning and enduring hope that would carry them all forward. Yet, as the archive settled into an uneasy calm, a question lingered in the air. How far should the archivists go in unveiling secrets that some wished to keep buried? The balance between truth and peace was delicate, and the next steps would demand even greater courage and wisdom. For now, the voices echoed on, a haunting melody of regret and love that neither time nor silence could fully erase. The low hum of the archive's air conditioning mingled with the faint crackle of static. As Evelyn Chang sat alone in the dimly lit listening room, the soft glow of the playback console casting long shadows across her face. Tonight, the archive was quieter than usual. The midnight voices momentarily at rest, giving her a fragile moment of solitude. Yet her hands trembled slightly as she cued the next recording. One recently uncovered in the depths of the archive's vast collection, an untagged reel found tucked behind older, forgotten tapes. The recording began with a hesitant breath, then a voice, a man's voice, distant yet unmistakably familiar. Evelyn's heart caught, the tremor in the tone, the slight hesitation before each word. This was her father, the very man who had vanished from her life when she was a child, leaving only silence and unanswered questions in his wake. Evelyn, if you're hearing this, it means I'm no longer there to say it myself, the voice whispered, fragile yet resolute. I'm sorry for the pain I caused, and for the silence that followed. I hope one day you can forgive me. The room seemed to close in around her, the weight of years pressing down as memories surged unbidden. Her mother's quiet tears, the whispered arguments, the empty chair at family dinners. For a moment, Evelyn was suspended between past and present. The archive's cold walls somehow warm with the intimacy of this confession. Meanwhile, across the room, Marcus Reed sat hunched over his laptop, the harsh light of the screen illuminating his furrowed brow. His fingers danced over the keyboard as he cross-referenced data timestamps, voice frequencies, ambient sound waves, seeking patterns in the inexplicable phenomenon that had transformed the archive into a crucible of memory. Tonight, the data refused to align with his previous models. The voices, he realized, were not merely recordings, but perhaps echoes intertwined with something beyond the scientific realm he had trusted. This can't be right, Marcus muttered, eyes scanning lines of code and audio spectrums. If these anomalies are real, then our understanding of time and memory here is fundamentally flawed. His skepticism wavered, replaced by a cautious curiosity tinged with unease. The archive's enigma deepened, and with it, Marcus's internal struggle between logic and belief. In the adjacent community hall, Lila Moreno paced nervously. The vibrant colors of her blouse contrasted sharply with the turmoil inside her. For weeks, she had wrestled with a family secret uncovered through the voices of truth that could fracture the delicate bonds she had worked so hard to mend. Tonight's gathering, meant to celebrate the town's heritage, now bore the weight of her decision. If I speak now, she whispered to herself, will I betray my ancestors or honor them? Her eyes flicked toward the door, where residents filtered in, their faces a mixture of hope and guarded skepticism. The choice loomed large, to protect the fragile peace or to let the shadows speak freely, no matter the cost. Meanwhile, Maya Patel lingered in a quiet corner of the archive, absorbing the stories unfolding around her. Each voice, each revelation, wove a complex tapestry of love, regret, and resilience. Her own grandmother's voice had emerged recently, adding layers to the puzzle of identity Maya sought to understand. Her gaze lifted to Evelyn and Marcus, their expressions etched with the gravity of discovery. In this place, where past and present intertwined, Maya felt an awakening, a call to embrace her heritage and the truths that bound generations. Back in the listening room, Evelyn's fingers traced the edges of the tape, the recorded words echoing in her mind. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with emotional peril, but also illuminated by the possibility of reconciliation. This voice, once lost to silence, had become a bridge. As the first light of dawn crept through the archive's windows, the trio of archivists faced the unfolding day with a renewed sense of purpose. The secrets unraveled tonight were but threads in a larger weave, one that would challenge, heal, and ultimately transform the lives tethered to this place where voices echoed and memories lived on. But as Evelyn prepared to confront the past, Marcus grappled with the shifting boundaries of science and spirit, and Lila weighed the cost of truth. The archive itself seemed to pulse with anticipation, its labyrinthine halls holding their breath for the next chapter to unfold. And deep within that silence, a new voice whispered, promising that the journey was far from over. The burden of truth, the late afternoon sun, cast long shadows across the old wooden floors of the Chang family home as Evelyn sat quietly, her fingers tracing the worn edge of a photograph that showed her father smiling, his eyes crinkled in warmth. Across from her, Tommy leaned back in his chair, arms crossed tightly as if to shield himself from the flood of emotions they both knew was inevitable. The silence between them was heavy, punctuated only by the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. "Why now, Evelyn?" Tommy's voice was hoarse but steady, a fragile wall against the memories that had long haunted him. Why dig up the past after all these years? Evelyn met his gaze, her eyes soft yet resolute. "Because the past doesn't stay buried, Tommy. Not when the archive keeps reminding us. The voices, they won't let us forget." He shifted uncomfortably, the tension in his shoulders betraying the calm he tried to project. "I thought we agreed to leave it alone, to move on. Moving on isn't the same as forgetting. And I need to know the truth about Dad, about what really happened." Tommy's jaw tightened. "You don't know what you're asking for. Some truths, they hurt more than silence." "Maybe," Evelyn whispered, "but silence has left us broken." The room seemed to breathe in the weight of their words, memories swirling like dust motes in the fading light. Evelyn reached into her bag and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook, the one she kept filled with unsent letters to her father. She opened it to a page marked with a pressed flower, her handwriting looping with a mixture of anger and longing. "I've carried this with me for years," she said softly, but hearing his voice through the archive. "It's like he's reaching out, asking for forgiveness he never gave. I have to answer." Tommy's eyes glistened with unshed tears, his defenses faltering for a moment. "I'm scared, Evelyn. Scared that what we find will tear us apart for good." She reached across the table, her hand resting lightly on his. "Maybe it will, but maybe it's the only way we heal. Together." Meanwhile, in the dimly lit archive office, Marcus sat hunched over his notes, the soft hum of the recording equipment filling the silence. His glasses caught the low light as he rubbed the bridge of his nose, exhaustion and frustration etched into his features. The scientific rigor that had once defined his approach now felt insufficient against the emotional storm unfolding around him. "I need to tell you both something," he said, breaking the quiet that had settled between him, Evelyn, and Lila. His voice was low, almost hesitant, "about the accident. The one I've been trying to bury." Evelyn looked up, concern knitting her brow. "Marcus," he swallowed hard, the weight of years pressing down like a physical force. "It wasn't just an accident. I made a mistake, one that cost a life. I've carried that guilt alone for too long." At a community meeting called to address growing tensions stirred by the revelations from the voices, she stood firm despite the murmurs of skepticism and veiled accusations. Her vibrant blouse and warm smile belied the storm of emotions within. "Our history is not perfect," she told the gathered crowd, her voice clear and steady, "but it is ours." These voices remind us that no family is without secrets, no community without pain. We must face these truths not to shame, but to understand and heal. A murmur rippled through the room, some nodding in agreement, others crossing their arms defensively. A man in the back spoke up, his tone sharp. "And what about the secrets your family has kept hidden for generations? Lila, will you expose those too?" She met his gaze unwaveringly. "If those secrets keep us from moving forward, then yes. But I promise, it will be with respect and care for everyone involved." The meeting ended with no easy resolutions, but Lila's courage planted seeds of dialogue and reflection that would take root in the days to come. As night deepened, the archive's corridors filled once again with the faint, haunting echoes of voices long gone. The walls seemed to pulse with a quiet urgency, a reminder of the burdens carried by the living and the dead alike. Evelyn, Marcus, and Lila gathered in the heart of the building, each lost in their thoughts, yet bound by a shared resolve. "We're not just archivists," Evelyn whispered. "We're keepers of memory, yes, but also facilitators of reconciliation." "It's a heavy burden." Marcus nodded, his eyes reflecting both weariness and newfound purpose. "But one we're meant to bear." Lila smiled softly, the flicker of hope mingling with the melancholic shadows. "For the sake of those voices, and for all of us." Outside, the town lay quiet beneath the stars, unaware of the reckoning unfolding within the archive's walls. But change was coming slow, painful, unnecessary as the burden of truth began to lift, revealing the fragile threads of forgiveness woven through the fabric of memory. And as the voices faded into the night, they left behind a promise that even in the deepest sorrow, there is a glimmer of hope waiting to be heard. The air in the archive was thick with a quiet anticipation, an almost tangible pause before the storm of voices would swell once again at midnight. Evelyn Chang sat at the small wooden table in the back room, the dim light of a single desk lamp casting a soft glow across her worn notebook. The leather cover was cracked, the edges frayed from years of handling, but inside lay pages upon pages of carefully penned letters, words she had never sent to the father who had disappeared from her life when she was just a child. Marcus Reed and Lila Moreno sat close by, their eyes fixed on Evelyn as she hesitated before opening the notebook. It was an unusual moment of vulnerability, one that transcended the usual professional composure they maintained around the archive's chilling phenomenon. Evelyn's fingers trembled slightly as she turned the first page, revealing a letter written in neat, deliberate script. "This is harder than I thought," Evelyn admitted softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "These letters are the parts of me I couldn't say out loud, the questions I never dared to ask." Marcus, who often wore his skepticism like armor, nodded thoughtfully. "It's brave of you to share this. It helps me understand why this work means so much to you beyond the archive itself." Lila reached out, placing a comforting hand on Evelyn's arm. "It's about connection, isn't it? The voices in this place, they're all about connection, even when it feels impossible." Evelyn smiled faintly, the first genuine softness in her expression that evening. "I always thought I was alone in wanting to hear those voices, to understand what was left unsaid. But maybe that's why this archive exists, for all of us." Outside the small room, the archive's corridors stood silent but restless. As the clock inched closer to midnight, faint murmurs began to ripple through the air, ghostly whispers threading through the stacks of dusty recordings. The voices once distant and fragmented now surged with increasing urgency, their pleas for forgiveness echoing with a painful clarity that sent shivers down the archivist's spines. Evelyn closed the notebook and looked up, meeting Marcus's gaze. They're getting louder, almost like they're calling us to something bigger. Marcus adjusted his glasses, the analytical part of his mind racing to interpret the phenomenon. There's a pattern emerging, one I hadn't anticipated. These voices, they're not random, they're connected, intertwined like a tapestry of buried secrets. But the emotional weight, it's challenging everything I thought I knew. For years, Marcus had approached the archive with a clinical eye, cataloguing sounds and anomalies, attempting to find a scientific explanation. But now, standing in the shadow of Evelyn's shared pain and Lila's impassioned resolve, the walls between logic and empathy began to crumble. Lila leaned forward, her expressive face illuminated by the lamp's glow. At the last community gathering, I saw how much this place unsettles people. Old wounds opened up, stories long buried came to the surface. But I also saw something else: hope. The possibility that by facing these voices, these memories, we can start to heal. Evelyn nodded, her eyes misting. That's what I want for the families, for this town, and for myself. To find light in the shadows. The three archivists sat together in silence, the weight of their shared mission settling around them like a mantle. Outside, the voices swelled into a haunting chorus, each word a thread pulling them deeper into the heart of the archivist's mystery. As the night deepened, Evelyn's thoughts drifted back to the unsent letters, the words she'd written but never spoken, the forgiveness she yearned to find. Her vulnerability had opened a door, not just between her and her colleagues, but into the very soul of the archive itself. The voices were no longer just echoes of the past. They were a living force demanding acknowledgement, reconciliation, and perhaps, in time, peace. And as the archive breathed with the weight of countless memories, the archivists prepared themselves for the reckoning that was sure to come, ready to face the shadows together, and maybe, just maybe, emerge into the light. The clock struck midnight. The air in the town hall was thick with anticipation, a palpable tension that hummed beneath the fluorescent lights. Marcus Reed adjusted his glasses, his hands steady but his heart pounding with a mixture of nerves and resolve. Tonight was the culmination of months of research, recordings, and sleepless nights poring over data that defied easy explanation. Now, standing before the gathered townsfolk, neighbors, skeptics, and curious onlookers alike, he was ready to share everything. He began with a calm, methodical overview. Good evening. Thank you all for coming. What we are about to discuss challenges our understanding of memory, loss, and the boundaries between the living and the dead. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some leaned forward, eager. Others crossed arms, skeptical. Marcus clicked a remote, and a recording filled the room. A voice, faint yet unmistakably human, whispering a plea for forgiveness. The voice was tinged with sorrow, a woman's tone that had been captured unexpectedly in the archive's midnight phenomenon. The audience was silent, some eyes glistening with tears, others narrowed in disbelief. This is not a trick or a recording fabricated by technology, Marcus continued. Our analysis shows these voices emerge spontaneously, carrying messages that resonate deeply with families connected to the archive. We have catalogued patterns, emotional tones, and linguistic markers. While science struggles to fully explain the mechanism, the impact is undeniable. From the back, a skeptical voice called out, "Are you telling us ghosts are real?" Marcus met the challenge head-on. "I am presenting data, not supernatural claims. But I will say this, These voices are echoes of unresolved farewells, and they demand our attention and compassion. Evelyn Chang stood near the side, her gaze steady and supportive. She saw the strain behind Marcus's calm exterior, the weight of exposing such a vulnerable truth. She knew this moment was pivotal, not just for the town, but for Marcus's own journey from detached scientist to empathetic believer. After the presentation, the hall erupted into a storm of questions and debates. Harold Jensen, his weathered face creased with years of guarded pain, stepped forward. My wife's voice, it was her, I heard her. But what does this mean for us? For our peace? Lila Moreno moved gracefully through the crowd, her voice a soothing balm amid the rising tension. She spoke of the archive as a vessel of memory, a place where the community's stories intertwined, urging everyone to see beyond fear and skepticism. Maya Patel, sitting near the front, whispered to Evelyn about the connections she'd uncovered between her grandmother's voice and others in the archive, signaling the growing web of shared histories. Dr. Helen Park, calm and composed, later joined Marcus backstage. You did well, she said softly, but be prepared. This kind of revelation will stir deep emotions and resistance. Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He returned to the archive later that night. The building's dim corridors quiet except for the faint echoes of voices that had become both his burden and his calling. Sitting alone, he listened intently, the voices weaving a tapestry of regret, love, and hope. Here, in the silence, punctuated by whispers, Marcus realized that science and empathy were not opposing forces, but intertwined threads in the human experience. As dawn approached, he resolved to continue bridging these worlds, knowing the path ahead would test him in ways he had never imagined. But for the first time, he felt the courage to face not only the mysteries of the archive, but the vulnerabilities within his own heart. The community's response was mixed. Some embraced the revelations, finding solace and connection, while others recoiled, fearful of confronting past wounds. Yet, through it all, Marcus's voice remained steady, a beacon guiding the town toward understanding. The chapter closed with the lingering question: could the rational mind open fully to the mysteries of the heart, and would the town find the courage to listen? And in the quiet shadows of the archive, the voices waited, their pleas echoing with renewed urgency, inviting all to reckon with the past and embrace the fragile hope of forgiveness. Helen Park, calm and composed, later joined Marcus backstage. You did well, she said softly, but be prepared. This kind of revelation will stir deep emotions and resistance. Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He returned to the archive later that night. The building's dim corridors quiet except for the faint echoes of voices that had become both his burden and his calling. Sitting alone, he listened intently, the voices weaving a tapestry of regret, love, and hope. Here, in the silence, punctuated by whispers, Marcus realized that science and empathy were not opposing forces, but intertwined threads in the human experience. As dawn approached, he resolved to continue bridging these worlds, knowing the path ahead would test him in ways he had never imagined. But for the first time, he felt the courage to face not only the mysteries of the archive, but the vulnerabilities within his own heart. The community's response was mixed. Some embraced the revelations, finding solace and connection, while others recoiled, fearful of confronting past wounds. Yet, through it all, Marcus's voice remained steady, a beacon guiding the town toward understanding. The chapter closed with the lingering question: could the rational mind open fully to the mysteries of the heart, and would the town find the courage to listen? And in the quiet shadows of the archive, the voices waited, their pleas echoing with renewed urgency, inviting all to reckon with the past and embrace the fragile hope of forgiveness. The community hall glowed with a warm, inviting light as people began to gather, their footsteps echoing softly on the polished wooden floor. Lila Moreno stood near the entrance, her heart thrumming with a mixture of nerves and anticipation. Today was the culmination of weeks of Planinja cultural event to celebrate the town's rich history, to honor the voices that had emerged from the archive, and to bridge the growing chasms between generations. Brightly colored banners hung from the ceiling, fluttering gently in the faint draft that whispered through the old building. Tables were laden with photographs, artifacts, and documents, tangible pieces of the past that Lila had painstakingly collected from families across town. The scent of brewed tea and freshly baked pastries mingled with the faint aroma of aged paper and polished wood, creating an atmosphere both nostalgic and comforting. As the clock edged closer to the event's start, Evelyn Chang arrived quietly, her presence calm yet purposeful. She wore a simple blouse and soft cardigan, her thoughtful eyes scanning the room as she carried her ever-present small notebook, the one filled with unsent letters to her father. Her fingers brushed the cover absent-mindedly, a reminder of the unresolved grief that shadowed her every step. Marcus Reed followed shortly after, his neat attire and glasses lending him an air of quiet professionalism. Yet beneath the composed exterior, his mind raced, grappling with the complexities of his research and the emotional realities unfolding before him. The archive's voices had challenged his scientific skepticism, and tonight's gathering would test how well he could reconcile these worlds. Lila stepped onto the small stage set at one end of the hall, her expressive face lighting up as she tapped the microphone. The room hushed, expectant. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice warm and steady. "Tonight, we come together not just to remember, but to listen, to honor the stories and voices that have shaped our community, including those that have long been silent." She shared tales passed down through generations, stories of hardship and hope, of love and loss. Her words painted vivid pictures of the town's founding families, weaving in snippets from the archive's recordings. As she spoke, the audience leaned in, some nodding in recognition, others wiping away tears. In a quiet corner, Evelyn's gaze flickered nervously. Her eyes found Tommy, her estranged younger brother, standing hesitantly by the refreshment table. Their eyes met briefly, unspoken exchange, heavy with years of silence and pain. The ambient notes of a folk song played softly over the speakers, its melancholic melody underscoring the fragile tension between them. Marcus observed the scene from across the room, adjusting his glasses as he reviewed the notes spread before him. Despite the warmth of the gathering, a crease of worry lined his brow. The scientific explanations he had clung to now felt insufficient against the raw emotions enveloping the hall. He realized that understanding this phenomenon required more than data-demanded empathy. As Lila invited community members to share their own stories, the atmosphere shifted. Voices rose in laughter and tears, weaving a tapestry of shared history that dissolved old barriers. Maya Patel, a bright-eyed young woman, approached Lila with a hopeful smile. Their conversation sparked a connection that echoed the event's purpose, bridging generations through understanding. Outside, the sky deepened into a velvety indigo. Stars began to shimmer faintly, silent witnesses to the moments of vulnerability and healing unfolding below. The evening drew on, the community hall alive with renewed bonds and tentative steps toward forgiveness. Evelyn finally approached Tommy, her voice trembling but resolute as she reached out across the years of estrangement. Marcus, moved by the evening's power, set aside his skepticism. embracing the emotional truths that science alone could not explain. Lila watched them, a quiet smile touching her lips. The event had done more than celebrate heritage. It had opened a door to healing, to the possibility that even the deepest wounds could begin to mend when faced with courage and compassion. As the last guests departed and the hall emptied, the archive's voices echoed softly in the distance, no longer just whispers of sorrow, but a chorus of hope. The bridge between past and present had been built, fragile yet enduring, inviting all who listened to walk across and find peace. But the journey was far from over, for beneath the surface of celebration lay the unspoken question: how to carry this fragile reconciliation forward, honoring truth without igniting old pain. The archivists knew their role was only beginning, as guardians not just of memory, but of the delicate threads that bind a community together. And as the night deepened, the archive awaited the next voices, the next stories, ready to challenge, comfort, and heal once more. The night settled over the town like a velvet shroud, the quiet hum of the local archive growing steadily louder as the hour approached midnight. Within the labyrinthian walls of the archive, the air thick and charged with something ancient, something almost sentient. The archivists Evelyn Chang, Marcus Reed, and Lila Marino stood together in the main corridor, their breaths shallow, eyes wide, as the phenomenon they had begun to understand took on a new, more urgent character. Evelyn's gaze drifted along the rows of aged tapes and recordings, their labels yellowed and curling, each a silent testament to lives once lived. The voices, once sporadic whispers, now swelled into a chorusum clear, others fragmented, pleading for forgiveness, for understanding, for peace. It was as if the building itself was awakening, its very bones resonating with the echoes of memory. "Do you feel it?" Lila's voice was barely a whisper, yet it carried the weight of the moment. Her expressive face, usually vibrant with warmth, was drawn tight with awe and apprehension. Marcus adjusted his glasses, fingers trembling slightly as he gripped a recorder. "It's beyond anything I can explain," he admitted, his usual pragmatism faltering. "I've run the data a dozen times, but the emotional intensity, it defies logic." Evelyn nodded slowly. "It's more than just sound or data. The archive is alive with memory. It's demanding that we listen, that we bear witness." A soft creak echoed down the hall, the aged wood reacting to the night's chill. The dim glow of the overhead lamps flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the voices. The archivists exchanged glances, a silent agreement passing between them. The archive was no longer just a repository of the past, it was a vessel for reckoning. The voices grew louder, layering over each other like overlapping threads of a tapestry. Some spoke of regret, a daughter begging forgiveness for words never spoken, a husband pleading for understanding after years of silence. Others were full of longing, mother's lullaby echoing faintly, a friend's final goodbye lingering in the air. Each voice painted a fragment of a larger story, a multi-generational web of secrets and unresolved farewells. Evelyn felt her heart tighten. The archive's call was personal, haunting. She thought of her own estranged father, the silence that had stretched between them like an unbridgeable chasm. Tonight, more than ever, the archive seemed to beckon her toward a truth she was not yet ready to face. Marcus's equipment blinked erratically as static crackled through the speakers. He frowned, adjusting dials, but the interference only intensified, as if the archive resisted being neatly categorized or contained. "It's as though the building itself is pushing back," he mused. "It wants to be heard not just through recordings, but through us." Lila stepped forward, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. We're the bridge now, between the past and the present, between the voices and the living. The archive's call isn't just a phenomenon, a responsibility. The rooms seem to lean in closer, the walls absorbing their words, the voices rising to a crescendo. Families who had gathered outside, drawn by murmurs of the midnight phenomenon, began to trickle in. Some faces were etched with skepticism, others with hope, all marked by the weight of untold stories. Evelyn met their eyes, sensing the fragility of the moment. "We can't ignore what the archive demands," she said softly. "It's not just about listening. It's about understanding, about facilitating forgiveness where it's been long denied." Marcus exhaled slowly, the scientist within him grappling with the inexplicable. "I'm beginning to believe that some truths can't be measured, only felt." Lila smiled gently, a spark of determination lighting her eyes. "And together, we'll help this community face those truths, no matter how painful." As the clock struck midnight, the archive thrummed with renewed energy. The voices, once distant echoes, now filled every corner of the building. They spoke not just to the archivists, but to the town itself, an unyielding call to remember, to forgive, and to heal. Outside, the night air was crisp and still, but within the archive, history was alive, demanding attention. The archivists stood firm, ready to answer the call, their own stories intertwined with the voices they had sworn to serve. The archive was no longer a silent witness. It was a living entity, a guardian of memory, a vessel of reckoning. And the archivists were its chosen witnesses, tasked with guiding the living through the shadows of the past toward a fragile, hopeful dawn. But as the voices grew louder, so too did the questions. How much truth could the community bear? And what sacrifices would be necessary to find peace? The archive's call had begun. There was no turning back. The night stretched on, thick with possibility and peril, the archivists caught in the resonance of memory's unrelenting grip. Each step forward promised revelation, but also risk. And in that delicate balance lay the fragile thread of hope they all clung to. As the first light of dawn threatened the horizon, Evelyn, Marcus, and Lila understood with quiet certainty the archive had chosen them not just to listen, but to act, to be the voices for those who could no longer speak, and the light for those lost in shadow. And so, with hearts heavy yet resolute, they prepared to face the coming days, where forgiveness might be found, or forever remain just beyond reach. The clock in the archive struck midnight, its chime echoing softly through the cold, still air. Evelyn Chang sat alone in a small back room, the gentle hum of the archive's machines a constant companion to the quiet ache in her chest. In her hands, she held a photograph, its edges worn and softened by years of handling. The image was of her father, a man whose absence had shaped the contours of her life in more ways than she had ever admitted. The dim light cast shadows across her face, reflecting the turmoil that had long simmered beneath her calm exterior. From the speakers in the hallway came the faint voice of a man, fragile and trembling, uttering a plea for forgiveness. The words seemed to ripple through the air, intertwining with Evelyn's own buried regrets. She closed her eyes and allowed herself a moment to breathe, to feel the weight of grief and longing that the archive so often brought to the surface. Outside footsteps stirred the silence. Tommy Chang, her younger brother, stood hesitantly at the threshold of the archive, his posture guarded and uncertain. Years of distance had built invisible walls between them, walls constructed from unspoken pain and the silence that had grown like ivy around their family. Evelyn rose slowly, the photograph still clutched in her hand, and stepped toward him. Their eyes met, and in that brief, charged moment, An unspoken conversation unfolded. Memories flickered behind their gazes, moments of laughter and loss, anger and love, absence and yearning. Neither spoke at first. Words felt heavy, fragile as glass. Yet beneath the silence was a tentative hope, a fragile thread weaving them closer. "Tommy," Evelyn finally whispered, voice catching. I want to understand." He swallowed hard, the walls around him trembling. "I don't know if I'm ready," he admitted, voice low but honest. She nodded, a soft smile touching her lips. "That's okay. We can take it slow." Meanwhile, in one of the archive's consultation rooms, Marcus Reed adjusted his glasses as he listened intently to Maya Patel. The young woman's eyes shone with a mixture of curiosity and resilience as she recounted the impact of hearing her grandmother's voice through the archive's recordings. The room was filled with an almost tangible sense of connection, threads of family history weaving together across generations. Lila Moreno sat beside Marcus, her vibrant presence a steadying force. "It's like the voices give people a chance to reclaim parts of themselves," she said softly, "to understand where they come from, even if it's painful." Maya nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "It's more than just stories. It's identity." Across town, in a modest living room warmed by the amber glow of a single lamp, Harold Jensen sat silently. His weathered hands trembled as he held an old tape recorder, the faint crackle of static filling the space before his late wife's voice emerged. The sound was fragile, distant yet achingly familiar, carrying the weight of years and unspoken farewells. Harold closed his eyes, allowing the sorrow to wash over him. Resistance warred with the slow thaw of acceptance, a battle fought in the quiet spaces of the heart. When the recording ended, he sat with the silence, feeling the first tentative stirrings of peace. Back at the archive, Evelyn and Tommy's conversation unfolded with hesitations and halting admissions. They spoke of their father, of the silence that had stretched between them, and of the voices that now called them to confront what had long been buried. Tears were shed, words whispered, and a fragile bridge was built over years of distance. Evelyn's notebook, filled with unsent letters to their father, lay open on the table, a testament to her journey toward vulnerability and healing. Tommy reached out, his hand resting briefly over hers, a gesture heavy with meaning. The archivists watched these moments unfold with a deepened understanding of their roles. The voices from the past were not merely echoes, but catalysts, agents of connection and reckoning. Yet not all stories found resolution. Some questions lingered, shadows of grief that no words could fully dispel. As dawn approached, the archive's corridors remained quiet, but the air was charged with a new kind of hope. The unspoken goodbyes, once trapped in silence, had begun to find their way into the light. And for Evelyn, Tommy, and the families they served, the path toward reconciliation, though uncertain, was now open. Outside, the first light of morning painted the sky with soft hues of pink and gold. The archive stood as a silent witness to the fragile threads of humanity, the yearning, the forgiveness, the enduring power of memory, and within its walls, the voices continued to echo, carrying the promise that even in loss, there could be healing. As Evelyn lingered by the window, she whispered into the stillness, "We are not alone." And somewhere beyond the veil, a voice answered, faint but clear, "Not alone." The heavy stillness of the archive at night was a familiar companion to Marcus Reed. Yet tonight, it felt different, oppressive, almost suffocating. He sat at his cluttered desk, the soft glow of a desk lamp casting long shadows across stacks of recordings and notes. The faint hum of the equipment was a steady presence, a constant reminder of the voices that had begun to haunt not just the archive, but his own waking hours. Tonight's recording played a voice that cut through the quiet like a sharp knife. A man, long deceased, recounted the moments leading to a tragic accident, words filled with regret, apologies whispered into the void. The story was hauntingly similar to the crash Marcus had caused years ago, a moment that had shattered more than just metal and glass. It had fractured him from the inside out. Marcus's fingers trembled slightly as he reached out to pause the playback. He closed his eyes, swallowing down the wave of shame and sorrow that threatened to overwhelm him. He had spent years burying that part of himself under layers of logic and denial. But the archive's voices were relentless, drawing him back again and again to the pain he had tried to escape. The next morning, Marcus found himself sitting across from Dr. Helen Park in a softly lit office, the comforting scent of chamomile tea mingling with the faint rustle of papers. Helen's calm eyes met his, patient and unjudging. "It's not easy to carry this weight alone," she said gently, her voice a soothing balm over the rawness Marcus felt inside. He hesitated, then spoke tentatively at first about the accident, the lives affected, and the guilt that had become a silent companion. Helen listened, nodding thoughtfully, guiding him through the labyrinth of his emotions. For the first time, Marcus allowed himself to confront the depth of his remorse without retreating into detachment. Days later, the community center buzzed with anticipation. Marcus stood near the entrance, his heart pounding in his chest. The air was thick with murmurs and the scent of fresh coffee. This was the moment he had dreaded and yet somehow needed. With Evelyn and Lila by his side, he stepped forward to share his research and the story behind it, his story. His voice wavered at first, but grew steadier as he spoke of the archive's voices and their power to reveal hidden truths, and the personal truth he had long concealed. The room was silent, the weight of his confession settling over the crowd like a tangible presence. Some faces showed surprise, others sympathy. Marcus felt a fragile thread of connection weaving through the listeners, binding them in shared understanding. Later, back in the quiet sanctuary of the archive, Evelyn and Lila surrounded Marcus with warmth and encouragement. The lingering echoes of the voices seemed less like ghosts and more like guiding lights, illuminating a path toward healing. Marcus realized that while the past could not be undone, forgiveness, especially self-forgiveness, might be within reach. As the night deepened outside, the archive held its breath, the voices waiting patiently for the next chapter of reconciliation and hope to unfold. The muted light of the archive's back room cast a sepia-toned glow over the cluttered desk where Lila Moreno sat, her knees drawn close to her chest, surrounded by a scatter of brittle papers and faded photographs. The musty scent of old parchment mingled with faint traces of wood polish, a sensory reminder of the archive's age and the secrets it held. As she unfolded a letter, the delicate script revealed a story far different from the one she had grown up hearing, a tale of betrayal and scandal, hidden carefully beneath generations of reverence and silence. Lila's fingers trembled slightly as she absorbed the words penned by her great-grandfather's hand, the weight of history pressing down on her with an unexpected force. His name, once a symbol of pride within her family and the wider community, was now tangled in accusations and regrets that unsettled her deeply. The discovery was not just a personal shock. It threatened to disrupt the carefully woven narrative of her family's legacy, a legacy she had dedicated much effort to preserving and celebrating. The revelation came at a crossroads, as the voices echoing through the archive continued to bring to light the complex, often painful histories of the town's families. Lila knew that sharing this truth would not be easy, nor without consequence. Yet, the archive itself seemed to urge honesty, to compel confrontation with the past's shadowy corners. Seeking counsel, Lila gathered Evelyn Chang and Marcus Reed in the dim main hall, the flickering overhead lights casting elongated shadows that danced across the rows of shelves. She laid out the letters and photographs before them, their faces reflecting a mix of surprise, concern, and thoughtful consideration. "This changes everything," Evelyn murmured, her voice steady but heavy with empathy. "It challenges the story we tell about who we are, not just as a community, but as individuals with our own tangled pasts." Marcus adjusted his glasses, his analytical mind racing to process the implications. "It also raises questions about how we approach these voices we hear, the secrets they carry, and the impact their truths have on the living. We have to be careful, but we can't ignore it." The conversation stretched late into the evening, weaving between practical concerns and emotional responses. Lila revealed her internal struggle, the clash between her cultural pride and the necessity of acknowledging her ancestors' flaws. She spoke of feeling betrayed, yet also compelled to embrace a fuller, more honest understanding of her heritage. Later, alone in a quiet corner of the archive, she stared out a rain-speckled window, the muted grey light falling softly on her face. The vibrant hues of her clothing seemed a stark contrast to the subdued world outside, mirroring the discord within her. The silence around her was thick with memory and expectation, a reminder that the past was never truly gone, only waiting to be faced. Just as the weight of the secret threatened to overwhelm her, Simon Lee entered the room, his youthful energy a sharp contrast to the solemn atmosphere. He carried fresh research, additional documents that shed new light on the context of the scandal and its ripple effects on the community's history. Their conversation sparked renewed hope, a sense that even the most difficult truths could lead to deeper understanding and healing. Lila felt the first tentative stirrings of acceptance, recognizing that honoring her heritage did not require perfect illusions, but courage to confront and learn from the past. As the chapter closed, Lila resolved to share her discovery carefully, to balance transparency with sensitivity, knowing that the archive's voices demanded not only truth but compassion. The roots of her family's story were no longer a source of unchallenged pride, but a complex foundation from which new growth might arise. Yet, beneath this resolve lingered the question: how would the community receive this revelation, and what new stories might emerge from the shadows waiting to be uncovered? The archive's quiet corridors seemed to whisper in answer, as the voices of memory continued their haunting, persistent call. The journey of reconciliation was far from over, and in the delicate dance of roots and revelations, Lila stood at the threshold of a transformation that would redefine both her identity and her place within the community. As the first murmurs of the community's response began to stir, Lila knew the roots she had uncovered would forever alter the landscape of their shared history, and the echoes of those changes would be heard long after the last voice faded into silence. The old wooden table groaned under the weight of countless tapes, transcripts, and weathered photographs, all scattered in a deliberate chaos that only Evelyn Chang seemed to navigate with ease. The dim amber glow of the archive's desk lamps cast long shadows across the room, illuminating the faces of the three archivists huddled together in focused concentration. Evelyn sat with a quiet intensity, her fingers tracing the edge of a brittle photograph as faint voices murmured from the playback device nearby. Marcus Reed adjusted his glasses and leaned closer to the audio waveform displayed on his laptop screen, headphones cocooning him in a world of whispers and echoes. "Look at this," he murmured, pointing at overlapping frequencies on the timeline. "These voices, they're layered. It's not just one family's regret or plea. They're intertwined." Lila Moreno, colorful scarf draped elegantly around her neck, tapped the transcripts thoughtfully. "It's like each family's secrets are threads in a larger tapestry. The voices don't just tell isolated stories, they connect, overlap, and sometimes contradict." Evelyn nodded, her gaze distant but resolute. "It's the ties that bind us unseen, yet unbreakable." The trio listened intently as voices from different eras and families merged into a haunting chorus. A woman's soft plea for forgiveness was met with a man's bitter lament. A child's uncertain apology echoed alongside a grandparent's whispered regret. The archive, once a repository of mundane records, had transformed into a vessel of collective memory, revealing the intricate web of relationships and unresolved emotions that bound the town together. Across the room, Harold Jensen sat in a worn leather chair, his weathered hands clasped tightly. The faint crackle of the playback device filled the silence as the voice of his late wife intertwined with another family's recording, revelation that stirred a deep, bittersweet sorrow within him. His eyes, usually guarded, softened as the shared pain of the voices bridged the divide between households. After the session, Lila organized a community gathering in the local cultural center, its walls lined with photographs chronicling the town's history. Family members, young and old, filled the room, their faces a mixture of skepticism, curiosity, and cautious hope. Evelyn stood at the front, sharing excerpts from the archive's revelations. "These voices," she began, "are more than echoes of the past. They are a mirror reflecting our shared history, our joys, our mistakes, our regrets." Maya Patel, sitting near the front, exchanged glances with her mother, her bright eyes shining with newfound understanding. Evelyn caught her gaze and smiled gently. "We're not alone in our pain. These stories connect us, reminding us that forgiveness and reconciliation are possible even across generations." The room buzzed with quiet conversations, faces shifting from shock to empathy, as the tangled web of past grievances began to untangle, connecting the community in a shared narrative. Late that night, Marcus sat alone in the archive, headphones on, surrounded by a halo of scattered notes and glowing screens. The voices, some familiar, some new, cascaded through his ears, weaving a complex network of shared histories. He paused, removing his headphones, and stared at the ceiling. For so long, he had sought scientific explanation, a logical framework to contain the inexplicable. But now, empathy seeped into his calculations, softening his skepticism. The archive was no longer just a puzzle to solve. It was a living testament to the human need for connection and healing. He jotted down a note. Memory is not a solitary thing. It's a communal echo, resonating through time and space. How do we honor it without being consumed? As dawn crept through the narrow windows, the archivists understood their task was greater than preserving recordings it was about. Weaving the fractured threads of their communities past into a fabric strong enough to support hope. And as the archive's voices continued to echo, they carried a message that was both haunting and healing. The ties that bind us are fragile yet enduring, calling out for recognition, understanding, and ultimately, forgiveness. The night's revelations left a lingering question in the air. How would the community embrace the intertwined nature of their pasts, and could they find peace in the unbreakable bonds of memory? The archive waited, silent yet insistent, for the next voice to be heard, the next story to be told, and the next step toward reconciliation to be taken. The late afternoon light filtered softly through the tall, narrow windows of the local archive, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floorboards. The air held its usual quiet weight, mingled with the faint scent of old paper and polished wood. Evelyn Chang stood just inside the listening room, her heart steady despite the familiar flutter of nerves that rose each time she prepared for a new family encounter. Today felt different. It carried the subtle tension of a long-awaited breakthrough. Harold Jensen sat across from her, his weathered hands folded tightly in his lap, beneath a worn cap that had seen better days. His eyes, a shade of grey, as somber as the overcast sky outside, flickered with a mix of apprehension and reluctant hope. Evelyn had spent weeks reaching out, sending gentle invitations and leaving messages filled with compassion, but the Jensen family had remained distant, protective of their silence. The voices that echoed through the archive, echoes of the departed, had stirred old wounds too raw to face. But today, Harold had agreed to come. "Are you ready?" Evelyn asked softly, her voice a soothing balm in the quiet room. Harold nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. "I suppose I have to be." For her, Evelyn smiled gently, squeezing his hand before guiding him to the worn leather chair facing the vintage playback equipment. Marcus Reed stood nearby, glasses perched on his nose as he double-checked the recording devices. His usual analytical composure was tempered by a quiet reverence, the skeptic's shield softened by the undeniable emotional gravity of the moment. Lila Marino lingered just outside the door, her vibrant presence a sharp contrast to the subdued tones inside. She exchanged brief nods with community members waiting in the adjacent room. Sensing the significance of this turning point, the Jensen family's willingness to engage with the archive's voices rippled through the community like a whispered invitation, encouraging others to reconsider their own reticence. Evelyn took a deep breath and pressed play. The room filled with the faint crackle of static, then a voice, fragile, tremulous, unmistakably familiar. Harold's late wife, speaking from beyond the veil of years, her words laced with sorrow and a desperate plea for forgiveness. The voice echoed through the archive's dim corridors, carrying the weight of unspoken regrets and the aching hope for reconciliation. Harold's eyes closed, a single tear tracing a path down his weathered cheek. Evelyn watched him with a mixture of empathy and quiet strength, knowing that this moment was both an ending and a beginning. When the voice faded, silence settled over the room like a soft blanket. Marcus lowered the volume, breaking the spell with the sound of mechanical clicks. He exchanged a glance with Evelyn, his expression unreadable but tinged with something close to awe. "Thank you," Harold whispered, voice rough with emotion. "I didn't think I could do this, but," hearing her, "it's like a door I thought was sealed forever has been unlocked." Evelyn nodded, her own heart aching with the familiar pull of memory and loss. Sometimes it's the silence between the words that holds the most weight. Today, you've taken the first step toward breaking that silence. Outside the room, Lila gathered the small crowd, her voice warm and steady. "This is more than just listening to voices," she said. "It's about healing the threads that connect us across generations. Today, the Jensen family has shown us that even the deepest wounds can begin to mend." The energy in the room shifted, a subtle but powerful change that hinted at new possibilities. Families who had once stood apart now exchanged tentative glances, their guarded expressions softening. Later, as the archive settled into its usual quiet, Evelyn found herself alone by the tall window, the last rays of sunlight slipping away. She pulled out her small notebook, the one she had kept for years, filled with unsent letters to her estranged father. The ink flowed steadily as she wrote, words that carried the weight of years and the fragile hope of forgiveness. "Dear Dad," she began, "I'm learning that sometimes hearing the truth means opening ourselves to pain, but it also means choosing to heal. Maybe one day we'll find our own voices again." The letter remained unsent, but the act of writing was a declaration, a step toward facing the silence that had shaped her life. As night fell over the town, the archive's dim corridors once again filled with the faint echoes of voices seeking forgiveness. But now, those echoes carried a new resonance, one of hope, courage, and the fragile beginnings of reconciliation. And in that delicate space between memory and the future, the community began to breathe a little easier, ready to face the truths that had long been waiting in the shadows. The journey was far from over, but the silence was finally breaking. The edge of forgiveness was a precarious place, one Evelyn Chang had come to know intimately over the past weeks. As the lead archivist, she carried the weight of every voice that echoed through the archive's ancient halls. Tonight, that weight felt heavier than ever. The air inside the archive was thick with a silence that buzzed beneath the surface, a quiet before the storm. Evelyn sat across from Harold Jensen, the family patriarch whose face bore the etchings of decades spent wrestling with regret. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the worn tape player, the device that held the fragile voice of his late wife. "Harold," Evelyn began gently, "you don't have to do this if you're not ready." He shook his head slowly, eyes fixed on the small speaker. "She's been speaking to me for weeks now," he said, voice rough with emotion. "If this is how I hear her, then I have to listen, even if it breaks me." Evelyn nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She pressed play. The room filled with the soft static of the recording, then a voice, faint, trembling, yet unmistakably hers. "Harold, I'm sorry." The words hung in the air like fragile glass. Harold's eyes closed, a tear tracing a line down his cheek. The archivist's heart clenched. This was the power and the cruelty of the archive vessel for memories too heavy to bear, yet impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, Marcus Reed stood a few feet away, adjusting the dials on the equipment. His face was a mask of concentration, but inside, a storm raged. His scientific mind screamed for logic, for explanations, yet the data defied reason. The voices, these desperate pleadings, seemed impossible to analyze or contain. Tonight, Marcus faced a difficult choice. His latest findings, if shared, could shatter the fragile hope the community clung to. He hesitated, his fingers hovering over the keyboard as the wind outside rattled the old windows, a mournful accompaniment to his turmoil. Lila Moreno moved between groups clustered in the archive's main hall, her vibrant scarf a splash of color against the muted walls. She was the bridge between the archivists and the community, the cultural heart keeping the wounds exposed yet tended. Two families stood locked in a heated exchange, voices rising with accusation and pain. Lila's calm presence was the only balm against the rawness that filled the room. "We all carry secrets," she said softly, "but the archive is not here to judge. It asks only for honesty, and maybe, in time, forgiveness." Her words hung in the charged air, a fragile offering to those whose hearts were frayed. As midnight approached, the archivists gathered once more in the central hall. The archive seemed to breathe around them, the dim lights casting long shadows over stacks of tapes and files. The speakers crackled to life, and a chorus of voices rose, a tapestry of confessions, regrets, and pleas for forgiveness. Evelyn felt the familiar ache of melancholic yearning swell within her. Each voice was a thread woven through the fabric of the community's history, binding the living and the dead in a delicate dance. "We stand on the edge, she whispered to Marcus and Lila, between silence and revelation, between pain and healing. Marcus exhaled slowly, the scientific armor he wore beginning to crack. And it's our choice how far to step forward. Lila nodded, her eyes reflecting both the weight and the hope in the room. The archive demands honesty, but it also demands compassion. The voices continued, echoing through the labyrinth of memories. For the archivists, tonight was a test, not only of their resolve, but of their very humanity. The edge of forgiveness was close, and the leap awaited. Are we ready to take it? Evelyn's question lingered unanswered as the clock ticked toward the hour when voices spoke loudest and hearts stood bare. The first confrontation came quietly, a family seated in a circle, their expressions taut with old wounds. Evelyn sat at the edge, her notebook unopened, her presence a steady anchor. A daughter spoke, voice trembling. I never said goodbye to my mother. We fought, and then she was gone. I carry that guilt every day. The recording crackled, her mother's voice echoing, please forgive me. Tears streamed down faces, barriers breaking under the weight of shared pain. Marcus watched, his usual detachment giving way to empathy. Science could explain patterns and signals, but not this. The human heart laid bare. Later, Marcus confided to Evelyn, I'm beginning to understand why these voices matter beyond data. Evelyn smiled faintly. We all need to be heard, Marcus, even in death. Meanwhile, Lila faced her own dilemma. A secret uncovered about her ancestors threatened to fracture her community ties. In a private conversation with Evelyn, she confessed, I'm torn between protecting my heritage and revealing the truth. Evelyn reached out, her voice steady. Sometimes, the truth is the only path to healing. The night deepened, and with it, the voices grew more insistent. The archivists moved through their roles with a blend of courage and caution, balancing the scales of revelation and restraint. In the quiet moments, Evelyn pulled out her small notebook, the one filled with unsent letters to her father. The archive's chorus stirred something within her, an echo of her own longing for closure. Marcus joined her, eyes gentle behind his glasses. It's okay to feel vulnerable, he said quietly. She nodded, the walls she'd built around her heart beginning to crumble. The edge of forgiveness was a place of uncertainty, of delicate hope. And as the voices whispered through the archive, the archivists stood ready not just as keepers of memory, but as guides toward the fragile light of reconciliation. The night was far from over, and the journey toward peace was only just beginning. Outside, the wind carried the echoing voices into the sleeping town, a haunting reminder that the past was never truly silent, and forgiveness, though elusive, was always within reach. The evening air was cool and still as the townsfolk gathered reluctantly in the archive's main hall, their footsteps muted on the worn wooden floor. Outside, the streetlights cast long shadows across the quiet streets, but inside, the dim glow of scattered lamps gave the room a soft, intimate warmth. A nervous buzz hummed through the crowd, families, friends, and those drawn by curiosity, all bound by the invisible thread of the voices that had haunted their lives. Evelyn Chang stood near the front, her palms pressed lightly against the smooth surface of a heavy oak table. Her heart drummed a steady rhythm of anticipation and dread. Tonight was unlike any before. The voices would not whisper in isolation, but rise together in a chorus unlike any the archive had ever witnessed. It was a night of reckoning for everyone present, and she felt the weight of that responsibility settle on her shoulders. Beside her, Marcus Reed adjusted his glasses, his gaze scanning the crowd with the analytical precision of a man still holding on to the last vestiges of skepticism. Yet there was a softness in his eyes, that hadn't been there before, hint that beneath his pragmatic exterior, he was no longer a detached observer, but a participant in the unfolding mystery. Lila Marino moved gracefully through the crowd, her vibrant scarf a splash of color against the subdued tones of the room. Her voice, when she spoke to calm a restless child or guide a hesitant elder to a seat, was warm and steady, a bridge between the past and present, between memory and hope. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked away the final moments before midnight. Evelyn's breath caught as the second hand neared the 12. The archive fell into a deep hush, every eye fixed on the clock, every ear straining against the silence. Then, as the clock struck midnight, the air shifted. A low, resonant hum filled the room, a sound both otherworldly and achingly familiar. From the speakers nestled in the archive's corners, voices began to emerge, overlapping and intertwining in a haunting symphony. The pleas for forgiveness, the whispered regrets, the broken confessions. It was as if the very souls of the departed had gathered to speak one final truth. Evelyn's breath hitched when she recognized one among them, a voice she had longed to hear and feared in equal measure. Her father's voice, fragile but unmistakable, slipped through the chorus like a fragile thread, reaching out to her across years of silence. Tears brimmed in her eyes as she listened to the words he never spoke in life, the apologies never made, the love left unspoken. Around her, the crowd was transformed. Faces softened, some contorted with pain, others glowed with a tentative light of hope. Harold Jensen, stoic and weathered, gripped the arm of a distant cousin, his usual gruffness melting into vulnerability as his late wife's voice joined the chorus, stirring memories and regrets long buried. Marcus stepped forward as the voices faded into a lingering silence. His voice, steady but imbued with newfound empathy, broke the quiet. We stand here tonight not just as witnesses to the past, but as guardians of its lessons. These voices remind us that healing demands courage and, sometimes, forgiveness must begin with ourselves. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Lila moved gently among the families, facilitating whispered conversations, her presence a balm amid the heavy emotions. She watched as two estranged siblings tentatively reached out to each other, as tears traced silent paths down cheeks that had long been hardened by grief. In the midst of the gathering, Evelyn found herself face to face with her brother Tommy. The years of silence and misunderstanding hung between them like a fragile glass wall. Their eyes met, full of pain, regret, and a flicker of hope. The voices had done what words could not. They had opened a crack through which reconciliation might one day flow. As the night deepened, the archive's walls seemed to breathe with the weight of memory and the promise of renewal. The voices, once haunting echoes, had become a chorus of healing, a testament to the enduring power of truth and forgiveness. Evelyn, Marcus, and Lila stood together, their roles as archivists forever changed. They were no longer mere keepers of records, but facilitators of transformation guides for a community navigating the delicate path from sorrow to peace. And as the last notes of the voices faded into the early dawn, a new chapter began, not only for the archive, but for all who had come to listen, to remember, and to forgive. The night of reckoning had passed, but its echoes would linger, shaping the town's future with a melancholic yearning and an aching hope for reconciliation. Yet, as the first light of morning filtered through the archive's tall windows, Evelyn could not shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. What other voices waited in the shadows, and what truths had yet to be uncovered? The archive's call was inexorable, and the path ahead, though uncertain, beckoned with the promise of healing. She took a deep breath, glancing once more at the faces around her, some hopeful, Some wary, all changed and stepped forward into the unfolding dawn, ready to face whatever echoes tomorrow might bring. The morning after the gathering dawned quietly over the town. The archive bathed in gentle sunlight that slipped through tall, dusty windows, illuminating the worn wooden shelves lined with decades of recordings. The air held a fragile stillness, as if the building itself was catching its breath after the night's emotional storm. Evelyn Chang sat alone at her usual spot, a small, scarred table near the back, her pen poised over a letter she had long hesitated to write. The paper was crisp and clean, a stark contrast to the notebook of unsent letters she kept tucked away in her desk drawer. This time, however, the words flowed with a softness she had not felt in years. "Dear Father," she began, her voice a whisper to no one but herself. The letter spilled out the tangled emotions she had wrestled with for so long: forgiveness, longing, and the aching hope for understanding. Each word was a small step toward the closure she had sought since his disappearance. The voices she had heard in the archive, the echoes of regrets and farewells, had finally inspired her to reach beyond silence. As she wrote, a quiet resolve settled over her, the weight of her internal conflict lightening just enough to let a flicker of peace take root. Meanwhile, near the entrance, Marcus Reed stood with his arms crossed, watching as families approached the building with tentative steps. The aftermath of the gathering was visible in their hesitant smiles and cautious greetings. Some exchanged nods of recognition, the beginnings of renewed connections, while others averted their gaze, still grappling with the scars revealed the night before. Marcus's analytical mind catalogued the subtle shifts in demeanor and atmosphere, but beneath his usual pragmatic exterior, an unfamiliar warmth had begun to grow. He carefully placed a folder on the reception desk, his research now intertwined with the stories and emotions he had witnessed. Data, he thought wryly, with a heartbeat. In the community room, Lila Marino's voice echoed gently, weaving stories with a storyteller's grace. She stood before a small group gathered around a circle of chairs, her vibrant attire a splash of color against the archive's muted walls. The stories she shared were not just echoes from the past, but bridges across generations, tales of love and loss, secrets unveiled, and the courage to face painful truths. Faces in the room mirrored a spectrum of emotions: relief, sorrow, hope. Lila's warmth was a balm, softening the edges of grief and encouraging healing through shared remembrance. Yet beneath her confident tone, a flicker of vulnerability surfaced, the ongoing struggle to protect herself, even as she opened doors for others. Outside, Harold Jensen lingered by the faded brick facade of the archive. His worn cap was pulled low against the chill morning air, and his weathered face bore the lines of a lifetime of hard work and guarded pain. As he watched a young mother walk by with her child, their laughter rippling faintly through the quiet street, a subtle expression softened his features. For years, Harold had resisted confronting the voice of his late wife that haunted the archive, unwilling to face the past's raw edges. Yet now, the slow thawing of grief was evident, a tentative acceptance that some wounds could ease, even if never fully healed. The archive had become more than a building. It was a testament to memory's power and the resilience of the human heart. Back inside, the archivists gathered around the main desk as the day progressed. The atmosphere was contemplative but tinged with cautious optimism. Evelyn shared her decision to finally send the letter, a gesture that felt both terrifying and liberating. Marcus voiced his commitment to balance scientific inquiry with empathy, acknowledging the limits of logic when confronted with the intangible. Lila spoke of the community's tentative steps toward reconciliation. underscoring the importance of continued support and dialogue. Together, they recognized that the archive's role was evolving from a place where voices echoed in isolation to a sanctuary where healing could begin, fragile but real. The community, too, was awakening to this new reality. Some families tentatively reached out to one another, drawn by the shared experience of revelation and forgiveness. Others remained distant, their wounds too raw, their stories too complicated for immediate healing. The archivists understood this was the natural rhythm of grief, a process that could not be rushed or forced. Their challenge was to remain steady, compassionate guides through the uncertain terrain ahead. As twilight approached, the archive's corridors grew quiet once more, the voices of the past settling into a softer murmur. Yet the echoes lingered, a reminder that memory was never truly silent. Evelyn glanced toward the small notebook she carried now, the pages filled with words no longer bound by silence. Marcus adjusted his glasses, a faint smile touching his lips, and Lila gathered her notes, ready to continue weaving the community's stories. Together, they stood at the threshold of what was to come, guardians of memory, facilitators of reconciliation, and witnesses to the enduring dance between loss and hope. Outside, the town's lights flickered on, casting gentle pools of illumination against the gathering dusk. The archive remained, weathered labyrinthine, and alive with the voices of those who had come before. It was a place of reckoning, yes, but also of possibility. And as the night deepened, the archivists prepared to listen once again, knowing that every voice carried the fragile promise of peace amid sorrow. But even as healing began, an unspoken question hovered in the air. How do you hold space for forgiveness when some memories refuse to fade and some wounds remain etched in the heart? The archive had stirred the past. Now the future awaited, uncertain yet charged with melancholic yearning. The soft hum of the archive's late evening air conditioning mingled with the faint crackle of old recordings playing from the dusty equipment. In the small break room, the worn wooden table bore the weight of tentative reconciliation. Evelyn Chang sat opposite her younger brother, Tommy, hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea. Their eyes met hesitant, searching. Silence stretched long before Evelyn finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I never stopped hoping we could talk, Tommy, about Dad, about everything we left unsaid. Tommy shifted in his chair, the familiar ache of old wounds surfacing beneath his guarded exterior. It's not easy, Evie. You left, you moved on. I stayed, held on to what we had. But maybe it's time to try. Evelyn's heart tightened, the years of estrangement folding into the space between them like fragile paper cranes, delicate and full of unspoken prayers. I want to understand, not just for me, but for us. Outside, the archive whispered its eternal chorus. Voices once lost now threaded through the corridors, binding past and present in an unbreakable weave. Evelyn knew their work was far from over. Healing, like memory, was a tangled tapestry, each thread vital, each knot a story waiting to be unraveled. Meanwhile, in the dim heart of the archive, Marcus Reed adjusted the settings on his recording equipment. His fingers worked with practiced steadiness, yet his mind wrestled with the intangible. The voices he once sought to dissect with cold logic now stirred something deeper, profound empathy that challenged his skepticism. He leaned closer to the speakers, catching the faint tremor in a voice pleading for forgiveness, the rawness of regret echoing through the static. It's not just data, Marcus murmured to himself. It's pain, it's hope. His scientific approach began to soften, embracing the complexity of human emotion woven into the phenomenon. This shift did not go unnoticed. Community members, once wary, started to approach him with their stories, their needs, their grief. Marcus found himself becoming not just an observer, but a participant in the town's journey toward healing. Across town, Lila Marino prepared the community room for another storytelling circle. The room bloomed with vibrant colors, ribbons, flowers, and hand-painted signs celebrating heritage and shared history. The scent of jasmine filled the air, mingling with nervous excitement as neighbors arrived, tentative but drawn by the promise of connection. Lila's warm smile greeted each participant, her innate charisma a balm for weary hearts. "This is a space for all voices," she said, her voice steady and inviting, "to share, to listen, and to heal." Stories unfolded like fragile petals, grief, regret, forgiveness, and love interlaced in the shared narrative. Lila noticed her own emotional boundaries tested, but she held firm, learning to protect her heart while fostering the fragile threads of community trust. Each story told was a step forward, a stitch in the fabric of collective healing. Late that night, Evelyn wandered the archive's labyrinthine corridors alone. The dim light cast long shadows on shelves lined with decades of recordings, each a testament to lives lived and lost. The voices echoed softly, a haunting melody of memory and longing. Her breath was steady, but her heart pounded with the weight of responsibility. "We are the keepers," she thought, "not just of sound, but of stories, of truth, of hope." As dawn approached, a fragile peace settled over the archive. Healing threads, once tangled and broken, began to weave a new tapestry, one of understanding, forgiveness, and the quiet strength found in shared vulnerability. Yet the path ahead remained uncertain. For every step forward, shadows lingered. The voices of the past whispered their truths, reminding all who listened that healing was not a destination, but a continuous journey. And the archivists, now entwined more deeply than ever with the lives they served, stood ready to guide the way, their own wounds slowly mending in the light of tentative hope. The chapter closed with Evelyn sending a text to Tommy, "Thank you for meeting me tonight. Looking forward to tomorrow." A simple message, but a powerful promise, beginning, not an end. Outside, the archive waited, its walls holding the echoes of both sorrow and the fragile threads of healing that now wove through the town's heart. And as the first light of morning touched the horizon, the voices softened to a gentle hum, carrying with them the tender hope that tomorrow might bring even more light. Maya Patel entered the archive that morning with a quiet resolve, her fingers wrapped carefully around a thin, worn cassette tape that had surfaced among the latest batch of recordings. The air was cool and still, carrying the faint scent of dust and old paper, a scent that felt almost sacred to her now. The voices that emanated from the archive speakers had already changed her life, but this tape promised something deeper, something more personal. As the archivists gathered in the softly lit room, Maya placed the tape in the player and pressed play. A faint crackle preceded the gentle voice of a young woman, her grandmother, long gone but alive in memory. She spoke in a lilting tone, a mixture of hope and hesitation threading through her words as she recounted dreams of a life filled with both hardship and love. Maya listened, spellbound, the layers of her grandmother's past unfolding like petals in bloom. It was a story of migration, sacrifice, and quiet resilience of a woman who had fought to carve out a space for herself in a world that often seemed indifferent. Tears welled in Maya's eyes as she heard the voice plead softly for understanding and forgiveness, not just for the mistakes made, but for the silences kept. The recording was raw and intimate, a window into a life that had shaped Maya's own in ways she was only beginning to grasp. For the first time, she felt a profound connection, a bridge spanning decades and generations, linking her to a legacy she was no longer afraid to claim. Meanwhile, Evelyn, Marcus, and Lila convened around a large oak table scattered with maps, archival documents, and notes. The archive was more than a building to them now. It was a living entity, a vessel of memory and reckoning. They discussed plans to deepen community engagement, new storytelling sessions, workshops, and outreach programs designed to invite voices from every corner of the town. Evelyn's eyes shone with determination. "We've seen how powerful this space can be," she said, "how much healing it can foster. It's up to us to nurture that, to make sure the archive serves not just as a repository of the past, but as a beacon for the future." Marcus nodded, pushing up his glasses. "The data supports that the archive's phenomenon is unique, but it's the human stories, the connections we build, that truly matter. We can't lose sight of that." Lila smiled warmly, her vibrant clothing a splash of color against the muted backdrop. "It's about community, about honoring our histories while forging new paths. We have a responsibility to protect that delicate balance." Back in the main hall, the archive buzzed with quiet anticipation as Maya prepared to share her grandmother's story at a community storytelling event organized by Lila. The room was filled with familiar faces, neighbors, families, elders, all drawn together by the archive's magnetic pull. Maya stepped forward, her voice steady as she recounted the tale she had uncovered. Her words wove a tapestry of identity and belonging, resonating deeply with those who listened. The room seemed to breathe with collective understanding, the air thick with unspoken gratitude and shared history. As Maya finished, a hush settled before applause rippled through the crowd, a sound of acceptance and connection. Later, as the night deepened and the archive's halls emptied, the three archivists walked together beneath the dim glow of sconces lining the labyrinthine corridors. Their footsteps echoed softly, a rhythmic reminder of the journey they had taken and the one still ahead. Evelyn broke the silence, her voice thoughtful. "The voices we hear, they remind us that memory is never truly silent. We carry it with us, in ways seen and unseen. It's our duty to listen, to bear witness." Marcus glanced around, the weight of recent revelations settling over him, and to be open to change, to let what we learn transform us, not just the community. Lila nodded, her expression serene yet resolute. "The archive is a place of endings, but also beginnings. We hold space for both." In that moment, beneath the archive's vaulted ceilings and surrounded by the echoes of countless lives, they understood their roles more clearly than ever. They were not just keepers of voices, but stewards of hope, guiding their town through the shadows of loss, toward the light of reconciliation. As the first hints of dawn appeared on the horizon, the archivists paused at the threshold of the archive's heavy doors. Outside, the world awaited, a world shaped by memory, bound by forgiveness, and alive with the promise of new beginnings. And so, with hearts full and spirits renewed, they stepped forward together, ready to face whatever stories tomorrow might bring. The conference room was quiet, except for the soft rustle of papers and the occasional scratch of pens against notepads. Evelyn Chang sat at the head of the worn oak table, her fingers lightly tracing the edges of a small stack of recordings that had become the archive's heartbeats. The dim lamp cast golden pools of light, illuminating the faces of her colleagues Marcus Reed, Lila Moreno, and the eager Simon Leach, absorbed in thought as they prepared to reshape the archive's mission. For months, the voices that echoed through the archive's dim corridors had brought both revelation and turmoil. Families were torn between desiring peace and confronting painful truths. The archivists, too, bore the weight of these echoes, caught between scientific curiosity, cultural heritage, and the raw emotion of grief and longing. Tonight marked a deliberate turning point. "We cannot approach this as purely data anymore," Evelyn began, her voice steady but warm. "The voices are not just phenomena to be catalogued. They're cries for closure, for understanding. We owe it to the families and to ourselves to engage with them compassionately." Marcus adjusted his glasses, nodding thoughtfully. "I've been wrestling with that. My instinct is still to analyze, to find a tangible explanation. But I'm starting to see that empathy is just as critical. Science and sensitivity must coexist here." Lila's expressive eyes shone with quiet conviction. "The community sees the archive as more than a building full of records. It's a vessel for memory, pain, and hope. If we don't honor that, we risk losing their trust. We need protocols that respect cultural nuances and emotional boundaries." Simon, the youngest of the group, leaned forward eagerly. "I've compiled some feedback from families and community members. Many expressed relief that someone is listening, but also fear of exposure or judgment. They want their stories treated with dignity." Evelyn smiled gently, appreciative of the fresh perspective. "That's why we're here to be guardians, not just archivists. We need guidelines that balance transparency with discretion and scientific inquiry with emotional care." The group spent hours drafting a framework that integrated trauma-informed approaches with archival precision. They consulted with Dr. Helen Park, the local psychologist who had become an invaluable ally in understanding the emotional landscape the voices traversed. "Trauma doesn't just reside in the past," Dr. Park had explained during a recent workshop. "It echoes in the present, in how people relate to their memories and to each other. Your work isn't just about preserving voices, it's about facilitating healing conversations. That requires patience, respect, and a deep awareness of boundaries." Inspired by her insights, the archivists incorporated strategies for compassionate communication, clear consent procedures, and community engagement sessions. They planned storytelling events and private meetings where families could safely explore the voices, messages, under guided support. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows through the archive's labyrinthine halls, Evelyn found herself standing alone in the main hall. The faint murmurs of distant voices floated softly, mingling with the creak of old floorboards beneath her feet. She closed her eyes, breathing deeply, feeling the weight of the archive's history and the lives it touched. Her gaze drifted to the small notebook she kept tucked in her bag there, one filled with unsent letters to her father. Tonight, she felt a quiet resolve to finally confront that chapter of her life, just as she had resolved to help others confront theirs. Behind her, the voices whispered on, no longer mere echoes, but purposeful calls for connection, understanding, and peace. Evelyn smiled to herself, knowing that the archive's legacy was no longer just about preserving memory, but about forging a path toward reconciliation. With renewed strength, she turned back to where Marcus, Lila, and Simon were waiting. Together, they were more than archivists. They were custodians of stories, healers of wounds, and bearers of hope. And in the heart of the archive, the voices waited not to haunt, but to guide. Evelyn's next morning began with the rustling of papers and the soft hum of the archive's climate control. The new protocols were already taking shape, folders neatly labeled, consent forms revised, schedules for community sessions circulating. Marcus sat nearby, headphones around his neck, reviewing spectral analyses with a newfound appreciation for the emotional undercurrents beneath the data. "I never thought I'd say this," Marcus admitted during a brief coffee break. "But there's something profoundly human behind these voices. It's not just sound waves and frequencies. It's pain, hope, and sometimes forgiveness." Lila joined them, her vibrant scarf a splash of color against the archive's muted tones. "We have a responsibility to nurture that humanity. It's what makes this place sacred, not just scientific." Simon chimed in, eyes bright with enthusiasm. "I'm excited to help facilitate the storytelling sessions. Hearing the voices alongside the families, it's like weaving the past and present together." Together, the team prepared for the first community gathering under the new framework. Invitations had gone out, and local residents responded with a mixture of curiosity and cautious optimism. Evelyn rehearsed her opening remarks, determined to set a tone of respect and hope. As twilight draped the town in a gentle veil, the archive's main hall filled with familiar faces and new ones alike. The scent of worn wood mingled with faint traces of jasmine from outside, and the low murmur of conversation created a comforting backdrop. Evelyn stepped forward, her voice steady but warm. "Thank you all for being here. This archive has become more than a place of records. It is a space where memories live, where voices from the past reach out for understanding. Tonight, we gather not only to listen but to heal together." The room settled into a reverent hush as the first recording played, a voice trembling with sorrow and the hope for forgiveness. Faces reflected the complex emotions, stirred tears, nods, clenched hands. Evelyn felt the powerful weight of the moment, the archive's purpose crystallized in that shared experience. Throughout the evening, families shared their stories, laughter mingling with tears, bridging divides once thought insurmountable. Marcus observed the interactions, mindful of his own transformation from skeptic to believer. Lila navigated conversations with warmth and insight, while Simon's enthusiasm brought fresh energy. By the night's end, the archivists knew the path ahead would not be easy. There would be setbacks, resistance, and pain. But they also knew that they had forged a new way forward, one where science, culture, and compassion converged to honor the voices that echoed through the archive. As the last guests departed and the archive settled into silence, Evelyn lingered, her heart full. The voices were no longer burdens but guides, and the archivists were ready to listen with open hearts and steady hands. The echoes had found their purpose. The morning light seeped gently through the stained glass, casting a kaleidoscope of colors across the worn wooden floor of the archive's main hall. The building, once a nondescript structure of aged bricks and dim hallways, now seemed to pulse with a quiet life, as if the voices it housed had breathed new meaning into its walls. Evelyn Chang stood amid the stillness, her gaze tracing the shifting patterns of light and shadow. It was a moment of profound reflection, a pause in the ongoing symphony of memories and reckonings that had come to define this place. The archive had long been a repository of mundane records, birth certificates, land deeds, faded photographs, quiet tokens of a town's history. But over the months, as the midnight voices emerged, the building transformed into something far more complex and vital. It was no longer just a place where history was stored. It had become a vessel for the living and the dead, a crucible where past sorrows and secrets surfaced, demanding recognition. Evelyn's thoughts drifted to the many nights spent in these halls, listening to the plaintive echoes of those long gone, their voices threading through the dark like fragile lifelines. Each plea for forgiveness, each whispered regret, had carved deeper grooves into the archive's essence. She felt the weight of responsibility settle anew, responsibility not just to the community, but to the very fabric of memory itself. Elsewhere, Marcus Reed was engaged in a different ritual. In a quiet back room lined with shelves heavy with tapes and digital drives, he handled the newest additions to the archive's catalogue. His fingers reverently traced the spines, a gesture once mechanical, now charged with meaning. The skepticism that had once defined his approach had softened, replaced by a reverence born of understanding. Each recording was not just data to be analyzed, but a fragment of a human story deserving care and respect. He paused over a tape labeled with a faded handwritten note, the voice it contained one that had deeply moved him. A sudden warmth crept through his chest, a sensation unfamiliar but welcome. The archive had changed him, just as it had changed the town. In the brighter atrium, Lila Moreno gathered a small group of community members for a tour. Her vibrant clothing and animated storytelling breathed life into the otherwise hushed corridors. She spoke with passion about the voices that had emerged, about the tangled histories and long-buried truths that now surfaced in the archive's embrace. To her, the archive was a bridge between generations, between cultures, between the living and the dead. Her listeners leaned in, captivated by stories of love, betrayal, forgiveness, and the enduring power of memory. Lila's role as a cultural interpreter was more vital than ever, her warmth and empathy helping to ease the tensions that lingered in the community's collective heart. As evening draped the town in shadows, Evelyn, Marcus, and Lila convened in the dimly lit conference room. The air was heavy with the residue of countless conversations, revelations, and emotions. Their voices were low but steady as they revisited the archive's journey from a silent repository to a beacon of reckoning and hope. Evelyn spoke first, her voice tinged with a mixture of sorrow and resolve. We've seen how this place holds more than records. It holds the weight of lives, choices, and the need to be heard. Marcus nodded, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose. It's become a living archive in every sense. We're not just caretakers of history, we're custodians of healing. Lila smiled softly, her eyes reflecting the flickering light of the table's lamp. And that means our work will never be done. There will always be voices needing to be heard, wounds to be tended. But that's what gives this place meaning. Their conversation wove through the complexities of their roles, the ethical dilemmas, the emotional toll, and the quiet victories. They acknowledged their growth, both personal and collective, forged in the crucible of the archive's demanding presence. Outside, the building stood stoic against the night sky, its silhouette etched against the stars. It was no longer merely a structure of brick and mortar, but a living testament to memory's enduring power, the archive's legacy. As the archivists prepared to leave for the night, Evelyn paused by the entrance, her hand resting lightly on the weathered doorframe. "We've been part of something rare," she murmured. "A place where silence becomes voice, and where the past can finally be met with forgiveness." Marcus joined her, his usual reserve softened by the moment. "It's a fragile balance, but one worth maintaining." Lila stepped forward, her vibrant presence a beacon in the dim light. "Together, we'll keep this place alive for the stories yet to come, and the healing still to be found." The archive's legacy was more than history. It was a promise that voices would not be forgotten, that pain could be faced, and that amid the echoes of yesterday, hope could quietly take root. The building, with all its shadows and light, stood ready to carry that promise forward, an enduring sanctuary for memory, for loss, and for the fragile, aching hope of reconciliation. As the archivists finally stepped out into the cool night air, the distant hum of the town whispered around them, living chorus of lives intertwined, forever bound to the archive's solemn call. Their journey was far from over, but in this moment there was peace, and in peace the possibility of tomorrow's echoes yet to be heard. With the dawn not far off, the archive rested briefly, its halls silent but charged, awaiting the next midnight when voices would once again rise, weaving stories of regret and hope through the stillness. And the archivists, guardians of these sacred echoes, stood ready, anchored by the legacy they had helped to shape, and the fragile light of a future defined by memory and forgiveness. The community hall was quiet at first, save for the gentle flicker of candlelight casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor. Chairs had been arranged in a large circle, an intentional space where no one was at the head and everyone had equal footing. Evelyn Chang stood near the entrance, her hands folded loosely in front of her, heart pounding with a mix of anticipation and vulnerability. This was a moment they had all been working toward, a space for voices long silenced to finally be heard, not just as echoes in the archive's dim corridors, but as living stories shared face to face. As the last of the townsfolk settled in, the soft murmur of conversation faded, replaced by a stillness that felt both sacred and fragile. Lila Moreno stepped forward, her vibrant attire a striking contrast to the subdued lighting, and began with a warm, inviting smile. "Thank you all for coming tonight," she said, her voice steady and resonant. "We gather not only to remember those who came before us, but to share our stories, to bridge the distances that have grown between us." Harold Jensen, his weathered face framed by the brim of his worn cap, was the first to speak. His voice was gruff but earnest as he recounted the years of quiet loneliness following his wife's passing, and the pain stirred anew by the voices that had emerged from the archive. "I never wanted to face those memories," he admitted, eyes glistening with unshed tears. But hearing her voice again, it was like she was reaching out, asking me to forgive myself, to forgive us both. Around the circle, heads nodded in understanding. Maya Patel, sitting beside Evelyn, shared how the archive had unlocked secrets about her grandmother that reshaped her sense of self and belonging. "It's like pieces of my family's story were hidden in plain sight," she said softly, "and now we can finally start to put them together." Evelyn's gaze drifted across the room and landed on Tommy, her younger brother, whose presence was both surprising and deeply needed. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, fingers twisting a folded piece of paper nervously. When it was his turn, his voice was low but clear. "I've been angry and silent for too long," he said, glancing toward Evelyn. "I didn't understand why Dad left, why you kept his memory locked away. But hearing the voices, seeing all of you here, it's making me want to try, to talk, to heal." A hush fell over the room, the weight of unspoken words suddenly lifted by Tommy's admission. Evelyn felt tears prick her eyes as she nodded, feeling the fragile threads of their relationship begin to reconnect. Marcus Reed, usually the stoic observer, armed with his notebooks and scientific instruments, set aside his pen. He had spent months trying to quantify and rationalize the archive's phenomenon. But here, surrounded by raw emotion and shared humanity, he allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. "There's something beyond data," he murmured to Evelyn later, as the gathering broke into smaller conversations. "Something that numbers can't capture." Lila guided the group in a quiet ritual of remembrance, lighting candles one by one and inviting participants to speak the names of ancestors whose stories had been carried by the archive's voices. The room was filled with a gentle warmth, the flickering flames illuminating faces marked by sorrow and hope alike. In this shared space, the boundaries between past and present, living and departed, seemed to dissolve. As the evening drew to a close, the archivists stood together near the doorway, watching as people lingered, their conversations less guarded, their smiles more genuine. Evelyn felt a cautious optimism stirring within her, a sense that the archive's haunting voices were no longer just echoes of pain, but a catalyst for healing and connection. Yet, even amid the hopeful atmosphere, a subtle tension remained. The stories told tonight were not endings but beginnings. There were still wounds to mend, truths to face, and forgiveness to seek. But for the first time in a long time, the community felt united by a shared purpose, bound by the fragile but unbreakable threads of memory and love. As Evelyn glanced across the room one last time, her eyes met Tommy's once more. There was a question unspoken between them, a promise whispered in the spaces between words, that this was not the end of their story, but the start of a new chapter where voices, both past and present, could finally find harmony. And as the candles flickered and the night deepened, the archive itself seemed to breathe with renewed life, its walls no longer just a vessel of unresolved secrets, but a beacon of hope for all who would listen. The story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The soft glow of the desk lamp cast a gentle pool of light over the scattered pages before Evelyn Chang. Outside, the archive lay cloaked in the deep blue hush of early evening, the distant hum of the town winding down for the night. Her pen hovered for a moment, a breath caught between hesitation and resolve. Then, slowly, the ink began to flow, words shaped with a care born from years of longing and pain. Dear Father, the simple phrase felt like the first step across a vast and fragile bridge. Her hand moved steadily, tracing the contours of thoughts she had buried for too long, questions left unanswered. Apologies never voiced, love shadowed by absence. Each sentence was a quiet reckoning, a release of the weight she had carried silently since childhood. The archive's stillness embraced her vulnerability, the faint scent of old paper grounding her in the moment. As the letter grew, Evelyn's thoughts drifted to Tommy. Their relationship had been strained by silence and unspoken grief, a reflection of the fractures left by their father's disappearance. Tonight felt different, the subtle shift in the air, a softening of the hard edges that had defined their distance. Across town, Marcus Reed stood by the large window of his modest apartment, a fading sunset spilling amber light across the room. The air was thick with the scent of rain yet to come. He held his phone, the screen glowing with a message he had hesitated to send for years. Turning, he dialed Lila Marino's number, his voice trembling barely above a whisper when she answered. "Lila," he began, "there's something I need to tell you, something I've carried alone for too long." What followed was a confession, raw and unvarnished, a release of guilt that had shadowed his every step since the accident. Lila listened with the warmth and patience that had become her hallmark, her heart opening wider in understanding. This moment marked not just Marcus's personal turning point, but a deepening of the trust between them. Meanwhile, in the archive's reading room, Lila prepared for a small gathering she had arranged. The room was alive with the soft rustling of pages and the murmur of quiet voices, the scent of aged paper mingling with the faint aroma of freshly brewed tea. Lila shared stories of her ancestors, weaving threads of history and culture that resonated with the listeners. Her words, vibrant and heartfelt, bridged gaps between generations, honoring the past while nurturing the present. Back outside the archive, Evelyn and Tommy stood beneath the fading light, the world around them muted and still. Their conversation was tentative, each sentence a careful step toward understanding. Old wounds surfaced, yet beneath the surface lay a fragile hope, a longing for connection despite years of silence. The shadows stretched long, but between them glimmered a tentative thread of reconciliation. Inside the archive, the three archivists later gathered in the quiet aftermath of these personal milestones. The building, once a silent vessel of secrets and sorrow, seemed to breathe with a new energy, one of acceptance, healing, and cautious hope. Evelyn's letter, Marcus's confession, and Lila's embrace of her heritage were more than individual acts. They were the quiet resolutions that rippled outward, touching the lives of the families they served. The archive's dim corridors no longer echoed solely with voices pleading for forgiveness. They now carried the softer sounds of healing whispers of understanding, the gentle rustle of turning pages, and the steady heartbeat of a community learning to move forward. Evelyn folded her letter carefully, sealing it with a steady hand. The path ahead was uncertain, layered with complexities and shadows. Yet tonight, in this quiet moment, she allowed herself to believe that even the smallest acts of courage could illuminate the darkest corners of memory. Tomorrow, she whispered to the night, I will send this. And with that, a new chapter began not only for Evelyn, but for all who had journeyed with the voices of the archive, carrying the fragile hope that forgiveness, though often quiet and unseen, was always possible. The morning arrived quietly at the archive, the kind of gentle dawn that seemed to hold its breath in reverence. Sunlight streamed through the tall, narrow windows, casting elongated patterns of light and shadow across the worn wooden floors and the countless shelves lined with recordings and documents. The air smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood, a comforting scent that had become as familiar to Evelyn Chang as the rhythm of her own heartbeat. Evelyn sat at her desk near the front of the archive, her fingers lightly brushing the edges of a leather-bound notebook. Inside were pages filled with unsent letters to her father, words she had never found the courage to share. Today, though, the silence felt different. It was no longer the oppressive quiet that once haunted these halls. Instead, it was a stillness steeped in the possibility of peace. The voices that emerged at midnight were no longer just desperate pleas for forgiveness echoing through the cold walls. They had transformed into something more nuanced, a chorus of memories, regrets, and sometimes even laughter. The archive itself, once a place of dread and unresolved pain, now felt like a sanctuary. It was a repository not only of the past, but also of the delicate threads that connected the living to the dead, the forgotten to the remembered. Marcus Reed arrived shortly after Evelyn, his glasses catching the light as he settled in at the console. Simon Lee, the eager intern, hovered nearby, eyes wide with anticipation. They began reviewing the latest recordings, a ritual that had become central to their day. Unlike before, there was a reverence in the way Marcus listened now, a marked departure from the skeptical detachment that had once defined him. This one, Marcus said softly, pointing to a waveform on the screen. It's different. There's a clarity, almost like a message rather than a plea. Simon nodded, his youthful enthusiasm undimmed. It feels like they're trying to tell us something important, something that could help us understand why this happens. Evelyn looked up from her notes, a small smile touching her lips. I think the voices have always been trying to tell us. We just needed to learn how to listen. Meanwhile, Lila Moreno was busy in the main hall, preparing for the storytelling circle that she had organized. Vibrant fabrics draped the walls, and old photographs of the town and its families were arranged with care. The room buzzed with quiet excitement as community members began to arrive, their expressions a mix of hope, curiosity, and cautious trust. Lila moved among them, greeting friends and neighbors warmly. Thank you all for coming, she said as she stood before the gathering. Tonight, we share stories, not just of the voices we hear in the archive, but of the lives behind them. We honor the past, not to relive pain, but to find understanding and healing together. The evening unfolded with stories that tugged at heartstrings and memories that bridged generations. Evelyn, Marcus, and Lila each found themselves moved by the courage and vulnerability on display. For Evelyn, it was a step toward the reconciliation she longed for with her own brother Tommy. For Marcus, a moment to fully embrace the emotional truths he had once resisted. For Lila, a reaffirmation of her mission to weave cultural heritage with contemporary healing. As dusk settled, Evelyn stepped outside the archive, the sky ablaze with hues of deep purple and burnt orange. The air was cool, carrying with it the faintest whispers of voices, no longer just pleas for forgiveness, but gentle reminders of love, loss, and the enduring human spirit. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, feeling the weight of the past and the fragile hope of the future mingling in the quiet town air. The archive behind her stood as a testament to memory's power, not as a prison of sorrow, but as a place where voices could find rest and where the living might find the courage to heal. Inside, the recordings waited, silent but potent. The voices would return at midnight, as they always did. But now, they carried a new meaning. They were no longer echoes trapped in time. They were threads weaving the community together, binding past to present, sorrow to hope. Evelyn's gaze lifted to the horizon, a soft resolve settling within her. The journey was far from over. The archive was still a place of reckoning, but it was also a place of beginnings, place for voices to be heard, understood, and ultimately embraced. And as the stars began to emerge, one by one, she whispered into the night, "We will listen, we will remember, and we will carry you forward." The night settled softly over the town, a gentle hush that seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. Within the archive, Evelyn Chang sat alone at the central desk, the dim glow of a desk lamp casting a warm circle of light around her. Before her lay a single sheet of paper, carefully folded into an envelope sealed with a quiet finality. Her hand trembled just slightly as she traced the edges of the envelope, the weight of what it represented settling deep in her chest. She had spent years collecting voices, some whispered, some raw and aching, that told stories of love, regret, and longing. Yet this letter was for a voice she had never truly heard, the silent one belonging to her father who had disappeared from her life when she was a child. It was a letter she had never sent, a conversation left unfinished. Now, it was her way of saying goodbye, of releasing the pain that had shadowed her for so long. Outside, the last rays of twilight filtered through the tall, narrow windows, painting the walls with long, soft shadows. The archive, once a labyrinth of silences and secrets, now felt like a sanctuary. The voices that had once filled its corridors with haunting pleas for forgiveness had begun to fade into something gentler, quiet echo of remembrance and hope. Evelyn's eyes shimmered with unshed tears as she folded her hands over the envelope. "This is for you, Dad," she whispered to the empty room. She imagined his face and outline blurred by years and memory, and, for the first time, she felt a flicker of peace. Across town, Marcus Reed stood on the steps outside the archive, the chill of the evening air crisp against his skin. His breath formed small clouds as he exhaled slowly, the coolness sharpening his senses. In his hand, he held a small, worn notebook, the repository of his confession, a recounting of a tragic accident that had haunted him for years. Tonight, he would share it with those who needed to hear, not just as an archivist cataloguing voices, but as a man seeking forgiveness. The lights of the town twinkled below him, distant and steady like the heartbeat of a community that had weathered storms both seen and unseen. His steps were measured but resolute as he turned to re-enter the archive, ready to face the turmoil and healing that lay ahead. Inside, Lila Moreno bustled quietly, preparing the archive's reading room for a gathering she had organized. Vibrant fabrics draped over tables, soft lanterns casting a warm, inviting glow. The room was filled with the mingled scents of tea and old paper, a sensory tapestry as rich and layered as the stories the archive held. As community members arrived, the space hummed with a new energy, hope, connection, and the cautious opening of hearts long guarded. Lila stood before them, her voice steady and warm. "Our history is not just in the past," she said, "but in how we carry it forward. We honor the voices we've heard by living fully, by embracing both our heritage and our own paths." Faces, young and old, turned toward her with attentive eyes. In that moment, the archive was no longer merely a building filled with echoes, but a living place of renewal and belonging. Later, as midnight approached, the three archivists, Evelyn, Marcus, and Lila, stood together by the window that overlooked the sleeping town. The archive was quiet now. The eerie midnight phenomenon had softened into a gentle hum, a quiet chorus of memory and healing. They shared a look heavy with the weight of what they had witnessed, the lives they had touched, and the futures they had helped to shape. Evelyn's gaze lifted to the stars scattered across the ink-black sky. "We are the keepers now," she said softly, "not just of voices, but of hope." Marcus nodded, his usual guarded expression softened by the quiet triumph of acceptance. "It's a new chapter for all of us." Lila smiled, a bright spark in the darkness. "And it's one we'll write together." The archive stood behind them, a weathered yet steadfast vessel of memory. It had been a place of reckoning, of painful truths and unspoken goodbyes. Now it was a Bacona testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring power of forgiveness. As the first light of dawn began to seep into the sky, the archivists felt the delicate stirrings of a future shaped by the lessons of the past. The voices might still echo, but they no longer haunted. They whispered promises of peace, reconciliation, and the unyielding hope that even in loss there could be new beginnings. And so, beneath the vast expanse of the awakening sky, the town, the archive, and its guardians embraced the echoes of tomorrow.